Chapter 1. The letter from Sussex. It was a peculiarly cold morning in late March when I received the letter that would drag me, and more reluctantly, my friend Sherlock Holmes, into one of the most singular investigations of our long association. I was sitting by the fire at my modest practice in Kensington, leafing idly through a medical journal, when Mrs. Hudson's stout cousin, who acted as my occasional messenger, rapped sharply at the door. "Post for you, Dr. Watson," he said, handing me a letter already damp with fog. I thanked him, closed the door, and glanced at the envelope. The handwriting was fine but hurried, and the address had been slightly smeared by the weather. It had been posted from a village in Sussex Downs, and the sender's name was unfamiliar, Miss Ivy Gregson. I slit it open with my paper knife and began to read. "Dr. John H. Watson, I pray you forgive the intrusion. My name will mean little to you, but I am a neighbour to Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I write to you with grave urgency. Mr. Edmund Blackwell, a retired apiarist of some renown in these parts, has died under circumstances that the local constable dismisses as natural. Yet those of us who knew him well find the matter troubling. Mr. Holmes has retreated from his inquiries these past months, and I fear he will not rouse himself for what I believe is a most unnatural death. I therefore appeal to you in hope that you might prevail upon him to investigate. If you should come, you will find me at Briarfield Cottage, beneath the beech woods. Yours in haste and hope, Ivy Gregson." I read the letter twice, then sat back, frowning. Holmes, retired these 3 years to his small farm near Fulworth, had indeed become a creature of habit and solitude. He raised bees, wrote the occasional monograph on obscure topics, and seemed perfectly content in the slow decay of the Sussex countryside. That he would be stirred by the death of a fellow beekeeper seemed doubtful. Still, something about the letter caught my attention. There was an urgency between its lines, a tremor that I recognized from old cases, a breath of fear. Poorly hidden behind politeness, I wasted little time. After closing my practice for the day, I made for Baker Street, where Holmes still kept modest rooms for rare visits to London. Mrs. Hudson, greyer but as sharp as ever, greeted me with a flurry of dusting and disapproval. "He's not been here in months, Doctor," she said, bustling. "Though he did send for some papers only last week. Had a young lad carry them to Sussex." "What sort of papers?" I asked. Mrs. Hudson shrugged. "Scientific stuff. Bees, I suppose." I left her, muttering, and made my way to the study. It was exactly as Holmes had left it. The faint scent of tobacco, the cluttered chemistry set, the Persian slipper that still cradled his pipe. I sat in the old armchair, thinking. Holmes would not respond to mere speculation. But if I could rouse his instincts, provoke his distaste for official incompetence, perhaps I might succeed. Without more ado, I packed a small bag, secured the next morning's train ticket to Sussex, and wired Holmes a simple message, urgent, matter requiring discretion and logic. Will arrive tomorrow noon. The following day dawned misty and bleak, the train rattling south through drab fields and sodden woods. I disembarked at the little station near Fulworth, and found, to my surprise, Holmes himself waiting on the platform. He looked much as I remembered, though thinner, more weathered by sun and wind. His grey eyes had lost none of their penetrating keenness. "Well, Watson," he said without preamble, "I see you have come equipped for trouble. You have the old look about you." "And you are better than I had feared," I replied, clasping his hand warmly. "I half expected you to be entirely lost to bees and philosophy." "Philosophy, yes. Bees, yes. But not entirely lost. Come, let us walk." He gestured to a path that wound away from the station and into the hills. As we strode along, I explained Miss Gregson's letter. Holmes listened without interrupting, save for a thin smile when I mentioned her plea for my intervention. "Ivy Gregson is no fool," he said at last. "A perceptive young woman, lives alone with her mother at Briarfield. As for Edmund Blackwell, yes, I knew him. A curious man, secretive, but dedicated to apiculture. His death was reported to me by Constable Treadwell as an unfortunate accident, and you accepted that?" "I accepted nothing," Holmes said sharply. "I merely chose not to interfere without cause. But your arrival, Watson, suggests that cause may indeed exist. It would be remiss of me not to at least take a glance at the situation. Miss Gregson seems to believe foul play was involved." Holmes nodded. "And so do I. But the method, the motive, the opportunity, those remain to be unearthed." We left the main road and turned onto a narrower track that led between fields studded with ancient oaks. In the distance, I glimpsed a scattering of cottages, and beyond them, the dark line of the woods. "Blackwell's cottage lies just beyond the crest," Holmes said. "A modest place, but with extensive gardens and apiaries." "And Miss Gregson?" "She awaits us at Briarfield. But first, I thought you might wish to see the scene yourself, uncoloured by opinion." We came upon Blackwell's cottage a few minutes later. It was a squat, stone-built affair, half smothered in ivy, with a sagging slate roof. The garden lay untended, spring weeds clawing up through the flower beds. At the rear, several rows of hives stood silent and abandoned. Holmes produced a key from his pocket. "I took the liberty of borrowing this from Treadwell," he said. "Official sanction, of course." The interior was gloomy and cold. Dust motes danced in the pale light from the grimy windows. The furnishings were sparse. A heavy oak table, a battered armchair, a collection of books stacked haphazardly by the hearth. We moved through the rooms in silence. In the bedroom, the bed was neatly made, the sheets crisp. On a small nightstand, I noticed a curious object, a shallow ceramic dish, filled with what appeared to be honey. Holmes bent to examine it. "Unusual," he murmured. "Blackwell kept no pets, and this is not the common raw honey one might expect. Note the viscosity, Watson, and the faint odour." I leaned closer. There was indeed a peculiar smell. Sweet, yes, but tinged with something acrid. "Poison?" I ventured. Holmes smiled faintly. "Premature, my dear fellow, but not impossible. We shall collect a sample." He took a vial from his coat and carefully scooped a portion of the substance. "There is more," he said, gesturing to a corner of the room. Propped against the wall was a large wooden frame covered in muslin. A beekeeper's frame, I recognized. It at once used to inspect hives, but this one had been crudely torn apart, the comb shredded. "Signs of struggle?" I asked. "Or sabotage? See here, scratches as if made by fingernails." A chill ran down my spine. It was all wrong. The abandoned hives, the odd dish of honey, the broken frame. Holmes straightened. His face was alight with that peculiar intensity I knew so well. We are on the threshold of something peculiar, Watson. Something designed. He replaced the vial in his coat and motioned me to follow. Come, let us visit Miss Gregson. I believe the lady has more to tell than her letter dared to say. We left the cottage and made our way along a path lined with budding hawthorn. The sun broke weakly through the clouds as we approached a neat whitewashed cottage set among tangled gardens. On the porch stood a slender woman in a dark green dress, her fair hair pinned up severely. She watched our approach with keen, worried eyes. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said as we reached the gate. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "Thank you for coming. You are in grave danger here." Holmes smiled thinly. "Excellent. Then we are precisely where we ought to be." Chapter 2. Miss Gregson's Warning Miss. Ivy Gregson ushered us into the cottage with a nervous glance toward the lane, as though fearful of being observed. Inside, the sitting room was modest but tidy, its walls lined with bookshelves and framed sketches of the surrounding countryside. A faint aroma of lavender clung to the air. "Please, sit down," she said, her voice low. "Mother is resting, upstairs. She is not well, her heart, and I would not have her disturbed." Holmes gave a small, courtly bow and took a straight-backed chair near the hearth. I seated myself opposite Miss Gregson, who perched uneasily on the edge of a settee. "You said in your letter that you doubted the verdict of natural death," Holmes began without preamble. "Kindly tell me why." Miss Gregson clasped her, hands tightly in her lap, steadying herself. "I have known Mr. Blackwell for many years," she said. "He was a strong man, hale for his age, and though he lived alone, he was by no means isolated. He often walked to the village to collect supplies, and he tended his bees with great diligence. 3 days ago, he was found lying in the apiary, cold and lifeless by the milkman, Tom Salter." "Were there signs of violence?" I asked. She shook her head. "None that the constable could see. Mr. Treadwell, the village constable, declared it heart failure without even a proper examination. He said the body showed no wounds, no indication of struggle." Holmes steepled his fingers under his chin. "And yet you are not satisfied." "No, sir, nor is Tom Salter. Blackwell had enemies, though few knew it. There was an argument only a week ago, heard by half the village." "An argument with whom?" Holmes asked sharply. Miss Gregson hesitated. Her cheeks flushed slightly. "I should say first that Mr. Blackwell had recently been engaged in experiments," she said carefully. "He had imported strange bees, foreign bees, from the continent. He boasted that he could create a new strain, stronger, more productive, more dangerous." "Dangerous?" I repeated, surprised. She nodded. "He spoke of bees whose venom was more potent, whose instincts were more aggressive. Some said he was mad, but I think he truly believed he could control them. And the argument? It was with Mr. Caleb Dunstable, a rival apiarist. Dunstable runs a large bee farm at the far end of the Downs. He accused Blackwell of reckless practices, endangering the entire region." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Tell me exactly what you heard." "I did not hear it personally," she admitted. "But Tom Salter did. He said Dunstable shouted that Blackwell would ruin us all, and that he would put an end to it himself, if necessary." Holmes leaned back, his expression unreadable. "A curious choice of words," he murmured. And what did the constable make of this quarrel? Nothing. He is a cautious man, Mr. Treadwell, and reluctant to accuse one of our wealthiest citizens without evidence. Caleb Dunstable is respected, if not liked. And were there others who might have wished Blackwell ill? Miss Gregson hesitated again, glancing at the window. "There is one more thing," she said, lowering her voice. The night before Blackwell's death, strange lights were seen in the woods behind his cottage. Lanterns moving about after midnight. Poachers, I suggested. She shook her head. Unlikely. Blackwell owned no livestock, and the woods are too sparse for serious game. Holmes tapped his long fingers against the armrest of his chair. Miss Gregson, you have done well to alert us. You possess both courage and discernment. Tell me, has anything unusual occurred since Blackwell's death? She nodded, visibly trembling now. 2 nights ago, I found a dead bee pinned to my door with a nail. Holmes's eyes narrowed. A message? She swallowed. I think so. A warning to stay silent. Holmes rose abruptly. Watson, we must. Waste no time. Miss Gregson, you must be cautious. Say nothing of our presence here. If questioned, say only that 2 gentlemen from London came to pay respects to Blackwell. She nodded mutely. Holmes turned to me. We shall visit this Dunstable next, Watson. I have a strong instinct that the bees themselves will prove key to this mystery. We left Briarfield Cottage and struck out across the fields, heading eastward where Miss Gregson had indicated Dunstable's estate lay. The sky was darkening with thick grey clouds, and a chill wind whispered through the grass. Holmes walked briskly, his head bowed in thought. Consider the facts, Watson, he said after a while. A man engaged in dangerous experiments dies, suddenly, apparently without violence. His rival publicly threatens him. Strange lights in the woods suggest clandestine activity, and a crude warning is delivered to an inquisitive neighbour. It does indeed suggest foul play. I agreed. More than that, it suggests a plot both ingenious and ruthless. We crested a small rise, and below us lay Dunstable's property. A neat arrangement of white hives, orderly gardens, and a sprawling farmhouse with smoke curling from its chimney. As we approached the main house, a large man emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a stained cloth. He was burly, thick-necked with a heavy brow and small, suspicious eyes. "Good afternoon," Holmes called, adopting an air of pleasant innocence. The man scowled. "What do you want?" "My friend and I are admirers of fine apiaries," Holmes said smoothly. "We heard that Mr. Dunstable maintains one of the best collections in Sussex." The man grunted. "I'm Dunstable. I don't do tours." Holmes smiled disarmingly. No, we would not presume. But might we trouble you for a few moments of conversation? We are keen amateurs, eager to learn." Dunstable eyed us both with open distrust, but at length he shrugged and led us toward a small yard behind the house, where rows of hives gleamed in the wan sunlight. "Beautiful stock you have," Holmes observed. "Italian strain." "Some," Dunstable said shortly. "I keep several varieties." "And you knew Mr. Blackwell, of course," Holmes said casually. Dunstable's expression darkened. "Knew him, yes. Foolish old man. Brought disease into this valley with his foreign pests." "You quarrelled with him?" "Aye, and I'd do it again if he were still breathing." There was no subtlety to the man's anger. It was raw and unconcealed. But you would not wish him harm? I put in gently. Dunstable gave a humourless laugh. Harm? He harmed himself. Fooling about with African stock. Madness. I warned him. I told the constable too. Mark my words, if there's an outbreak, it'll be on his head. Holmes raised an eyebrow. African stock, you say? Imported illegally, I assume. Dunstable nodded grimly. Most likely. You can't bring in bees without a licence, but Blackwell thought he was above such things. He had friends, scientific, men sending him specimens. And what became of these exotic bees? Holmes asked. Dunstable shrugged. Dead, most of them. Couldn't survive our winters. But he kept trying. He thought he could crossbreed them, make a new strain. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Tell me, Mr. Dunstable, did you notice anything strange the night before Blackwell's death? Dunstable hesitated, then jerked his head toward the woods. Lanterns. I thought it might be smugglers or gypsies, but no one reported anything stolen. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. One final question, he said. Do you know of anyone who might have wished Blackwell worse harm than yourself? Dunstable barked a harsh laugh. You mean real harm? There's old Ephraim Rowntree. Blackwell ruined him years ago, over a land dispute. Rowntree never forgot. Holmes thanked him, and we made our way back to the road. The clouds had thickened into an ominous blanket, and a fine cold rain had begun to fall. Rowntree, Holmes muttered. Another player in this grim little drama. And the bees? I asked. Holmes gave a rare, grim smile. The bees, Watson, are the heart of it. I am certain of that. But to understand their role, we must go deeper, much deeper. He pulled his collar up against the rain. Tonight, we pay a visit to Blackwell's hives by moonlight. Bring your stoutest boots and your revolver. Chapter 3. The Silent Hives. The rain abated as dusk settled, leaving the village swaddled in a cold mist. Holmes and I dined briefly at the Swan and Goose Inn, a humble establishment of low beams and smoky hearth, and as darkness fell fully over the countryside, we set out for Blackwell's abandoned property. Holmes had insisted on bringing 2 lanterns, both carefully shaded, and of course my trusty service revolver, loaded and ready. The road was deserted, the only sound the muffled drip of water from the hedgerows. In the distance, the downs loomed like ghostly leviathans. Observe Dunstable's hands this afternoon, Watson, Holmes asked as we strode along. I did. Rough, calloused. What of it? A detail, he said, but revealing. A true beekeeper's hands are not those of a ruffian. Dunstable's anger seemed genuine, but his coarseness suggests a man, more comfortable with blunt force than subtlety. We must not discount him, but neither should we fixate too narrowly. I confess I had thought his openness suspiciously bold, I said. Yet if he were guilty, would he not feign innocence? Holmes chuckled softly. Some men, Watson, consider their own temperaments to be their greatest alibis. We reached Blackwell's gate, its latch sagging drunkenly from the post. Beyond, the cottage crouched in darkness, its windows black against the mist. Holmes raised a hand for silence and opened the gate with a slow creak. We slipped inside, boots muffled on the sodden earth. The hives lay behind the house, a dozen, pale boxes aligned like tombstones. The garden was a tangle of untrimmed vines and brittle rose bushes. Holmes led the way, moving with a swiftness that belied his apparent languor. The apiary was eerily silent. No hum of bees greeted us, no industrious murmur. Only the wind sighed through the empty combs. Dead, Holmes whispered, sweeping his lantern's narrow beam across the nearest hive. Or gone. He bent to examine the entrance of one hive, brushing aside a clump of sodden straw. "Note the claw marks," he murmured. I peered closer. Indeed, deep grooves marred the wood, marks too jagged and forceful to have been made by insects. Holmes touched them lightly. Badgers or foxes might be responsible, he said, or human hands seeking something within. He rose, his expression grim. "We shall inspect the house." We moved to the cottage's rear door, which yielded after Holmes produced a thin slip of metal and manipulated the lock with swift, precise motions. Inside, the air was thick with the musty smell of damp wood and old smoke. The sitting room was as Miss Gregson had described it, neat, sparsely furnished, a few personal effects giving hints of Blackwell's life. An old fiddle propped in the corner, a shelf of worn scientific journals, a battered armchair with a patchwork cushion. Holmes prowled the room, examining each object with the detached scrutiny of a museum curator. I hung back, lantern raised, alert for any sign of intrusion. After a moment, Holmes grunted softly. "Here, Watson." He gestured to a side table where a thin book lay open, its pages warped by moisture. I stepped closer and saw that it was a ledger, each page filled with Blackwell's tidy script. "Notes on breeding experiments," Holmes said. "See here, cross-referencing Italian and African strains. Observations on aggression, resilience, venom potency." He turned several pages, his eyes narrowing. "And here, a record of an imported queen, marked only as Specimen A. No mention of a license or customs documentation. Most irregular." He closed the book carefully. "We must find the specimen, or what remains of it." A noise outside made me start. A faint scuff of boot against gravel. Holmes extinguished his lantern at once, plunging us into darkness. I followed suit, heart pounding. We waited, breath held. Another sound, the creak of the gate swinging shut. Holmes moved to the window with the silent grace of a cat, peering out through a crack in the shutter. After a tense minute, he turned back, voice low. Someone was watching the house. "Dunstable?" I whispered. "Possibly. Or another party. In either case, they know we are interested." He relit his lantern, shielding the glow carefully. "We must work quickly. Upstairs." The staircase was narrow and steep. At the top, we found two small bedrooms, one plainly Blackwell's, with a heavy oak bed and a washstand, the other serving as a study. Holmes went straight to the study desk, rifling through drawers with methodical precision. "Correspondence," he said, flipping through a sheaf of letters. "Mostly mundane. Ah, this is better." He pulled out a thick envelope, from which several folded sheets tumbled. I leaned in to read over his shoulder. The first was a letter dated 6 months earlier. "Dear Blackwell, the specimen has been secured and shipped under separate cover. Extreme caution must be exercised. These bees are not to be handled lightly. You are advised to maintain strict isolation protocols. S. The second letter, more recent, was shorter and unsigned. You have gone too far. Cease your experiments, or you will suffer the consequences. Holmes tucked the letters into his coat. A clear threat, he said. But from whom? I scanned the room, noting a curious detail. A heavy iron box set into the wall, its door hanging ajar. Inside were a few battered notebooks, a cracked magnifying lens, and, incongruously, a child's wooden spinning top. Holmes noted my interest. A poor man's safe, he said, and recently rifled. See the dust disturbed here and the scuff, marks on the floor. He straightened, a shadow crossing his face. Whatever lay within was of value, and it is gone. Suddenly, from the floor below, a floorboard creaked. Holmes extinguished the lantern instantly, and we both dropped into crouches behind the bed. The seconds dragged, each breath loud in my ears. Footsteps moved through the sitting room, slow, deliberate. A faint clink of metal. The intruder was searching just as we were. Holmes leaned close, his whisper barely audible. We must surprise him. On my count. 3, 2, now! We sprang from hiding and thundered down the staircase. Holmes's lantern flared as he threw, it wide, illuminating a dark figure crouched by the hearth. The man bolted for the door. Stop! I roared, drawing my revolver. But he was fast, frighteningly so. He darted through the open doorway and into the night. Holmes was after him in an instant, and I followed, my boots slipping on the wet grass. The man ran for the woods, lantern light bobbing wildly ahead. Holmes gained on him with surprising speed, but just as he reached out, the fugitive hurled a small object to the ground. A sharp hiss filled the air. "Back, Watson!" Holmes cried. We stumbled backward as a cloud of smoke erupted from the ground, acrid, stinging. My eyes watered and I coughed violently, half blinded. By the time the smoke cleared, the man was gone. Holmes retrieved the device, a small brass canister cleverly rigged with a fuse and chemicals. A smoke bomb, he said grimly. Military grade. Whoever he was, I gasped, still coughing. He came prepared. Holmes nodded, eyes glinting in the moonlight. And he will come again. Of that I am certain. We made our way back to the cottage, shaken but unharmed. Inside, Holmes examined the scene by the hearth where the intruder had been searching. A loose floorboard, pried up. Beneath it, nothing but bare earth. Too late, Holmes muttered. Whatever he sought, he has either found or was too late for himself. He straightened, his face thoughtful. We must discover the contents of Blackwell's missing safe. The key to this mystery lies not merely in the bees, but in what they represented. And what of the man we saw? I asked. Holmes's mouth set in a hard line. A professional, resourceful, desperate, and utterly ruthless. He tapped a finger against his lips. Tomorrow, we visit Ephraim Rowntree, and we begin digging into Blackwell's correspondence, particularly the mysterious S. He smiled thinly. The game, Watson, is afoot, and growing more perilous by the hour. Chapter 4. The Keeper of Secrets morning broke grey and sluggish. Over the village, the mist lingering in damp patches along the hedgerows and drifting over the cobbled lanes like reluctant ghosts. Holmes and I breakfasted hastily at the inn, he taking nothing but black coffee, and by 9 o'clock we set out toward Ephraim Rowntree's residence, a modest stone cottage tucked into the slope of the southern hill. Holmes walked briskly, his hands clasped behind his back, head bowed in thought. He spoke little, save for occasional mutterings that escaped him almost unconsciously. Phrases like double bluff and reagent drift that made little sense to me in isolation. "Tell me, Watson," he said at length as we approached, a low gate flanked by two sagging bee-skeps. "What do you make of Mr. Rowntree?" "A reclusive man by all accounts," I answered. "Highly respected in beekeeping circles. Miss Gregson described him as something of a mentor to Blackwell." "Precisely. And yet curiously absent since Blackwell's death. He may be grieving," I suggested. Holmes gave a non-committal grunt. "Or calculating." He rapped smartly on the cottage door. After a moment we heard the scrape of a chair, the creak of floorboards, and finally the door opened a cautious 2 inches. Ephraim Rowntree peered out. He was a thin, wiry man in his 60s, with a face like an old walnut and sharp, darting, eyes the colour of river stones. His sparse hair was combed meticulously across a pink scalp, and he wore a frayed brown jacket, smelling faintly of smoke and beeswax. "Good morning," Holmes said pleasantly. "Mr. Rowntree, I presume?" Rowntree nodded, but made no move to open the door wider. "We should like to ask you a few questions regarding the late Mr. Blackwell," Holmes continued. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. John Watson." Acute heard the mention of his name. A flicker of recognition crossed Rowntree's face. He hesitated, then stepped back, allowing us entry. The cottage interior was Spartan but clean. A single room served as kitchen, sitting area, and workshop, with a narrow staircase leading upward. Several beekeeping veils hung from pegs by the door, and a battered workbench near the hearth held an array of wax moulds and hive frames. Rowntree gestured stiffly to 2 hard chairs by the fire. "I've told the police all I know," he said, voice rasping like dry leaves. "Nothing more to say." Holmes smiled faintly and sat. "I am not the police, Mr. Rowntree. I have a different kind of interest, one that concerns itself less with formalities and more with truth." Rowntree eyed him warily, but said nothing. Holmes leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "You and Blackwell were close colleagues." Rowntree shrugged. "We worked the same fairs, exchanged breeding stock now and again. That's all. No mentorship?" "Bah!" Rowntree spat into the hearth. "He was an arrogant young fool, thought he could outbreed nature itself, mixing strains that ought not to mix, playing God." A note of real bitterness crept into his voice. "And did you oppose him openly?" Holmes asked. Rowntree's gaze hardened. "I warned him. I said, 'Arthur, mark me, you're courting disaster.' But he wouldn't listen, full of his own cleverness, had no respect for the old ways." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Was he working on anything unusual of late? Rowntree hesitated just a beat too long. Not that I know of. Holmes's expression did not change, but I knew he had registered the lie. "You see, Mr. Rowntree," Holmes said softly, "I have reason to believe Blackwell was conducting experiments with imported specimens, creatures of considerable aggression and toxicity." Rowntree's mouth tightened into a hard line. "You believe what you like." Holmes rose, pacing the small room. "And yet," he mused aloud, "there were warnings, threats, a missing specimen, and now a dead man. He turned sharply. You send the threatening letter, Mr. Rowntree. The old man recoiled, scandalized. Never. I don't hold with cowards' tricks. Holmes studied him a moment longer, then sat again. Very well. Let us speak plainly. We have reason to believe Blackwell's death was not an accident. We have evidence of forced entry into his home and theft of his research. We have witnessed at least one attempt to impede our investigation through violence. Rowntree shifted uneasily. If you know something, Holmes pressed, now is the time to speak. For a long moment, Rowntree was silent. Then he sighed heavily, as if a great weight had settled on his narrow shoulders. There was a man, he said at last, voice low, came asking about Blackwell some months back. Foreign, by the sound of him. Didn't give a name. Holmes leaned forward intently. What did this man want? Rowntree grimaced. Information. Wanted to know if Blackwell had bred a certain queen. Said it was critical to future operations. Offered me money to betray him. And you refused? Rowntree's pride flickered for a moment. I threw him off my land. Holmes's eyes gleamed. This man, could you describe him? Rowntree nodded reluctantly. Tall, clean-shaven, wore a city coat, fine boots, had a walking stick with a silver fox's head, eyes like ice water. Holmes tapped a finger against his knee thoughtfully. Interesting, very interesting. He stood. Thank you, Mr. Rowntree. You have been of great service. Rowntree grunted but did not rise to see us out. Outside, the mist had begun to lift, revealing the rolling green of the downs. Holmes set a brisk pace back toward the village, his expression animated. Well, Watson, he said, we have our first clear glimpse of the larger machinery behind Blackwell's death. A foreign agent, perhaps, I ventured. Holmes nodded. Possibly, or an agent of commerce, which is often worse. Consider, Blackwell breeds an exceptionally aggressive strain of bee, one with potential military or industrial applications. He refuses to sell or cooperate. Forces beyond the village seek to compel or acquire his research by other means. And the theft from his safe, I asked. Almost certainly the theft of his breeding notes. Or perhaps the Queen herself, if she survived. We reached the Swan and Goose Inn, where Holmes paused by the low garden wall, gazing out across the fields. There is still much we do not know, he said. The identity of the man with the silver fox cane, the exact nature of Blackwell's research, the motive behind the threat, and most crucially, whether the danger has truly passed. He turned, a glint of excitement in his eye. We must set a trap, Watson. Tonight. A trap, I echoed. Holmes smiled thinly. We shall announce, discreetly, that Blackwell's final journal has been found and is now in my possession. The true hunter Watson will not resist such bait. And what of the risk to yourself? I asked, sharply. Holmes shrugged. Risk is the spice of the hunt, my dear fellow. Besides, you will be at my side with that excellent revolver of yours. I shook my head, half in exasperation, half in admiration. What setting do you propose for? This little charade? I asked. Holmes considered. The Blackwell cottage. It remains the most logical lure. Let us arrange matters for tonight. Before the next mist rises, I intend to have our quarry in hand, or at the very least a clearer view of the battlefield. As we returned to our rooms to prepare, A shiver of anticipation ran through me. The hunt was quickening, and somewhere, in the gathering dusk, our adversary was surely watching, waiting, preparing to strike once more. Chapter 5. The Trap at Midnight. The sun dipped early behind the distant hills, casting the village into a premature dusk. Long shadows stretched like fingers across the cobbled streets as Holmes and I made our preparations. At his request, I had placed a notice with the innkeeper, discreetly but effectively hinting that Mr. Holmes had discovered a document crucial to the investigation into Arthur Blackwell's death. The innkeeper, a notorious gossip under a thin veil of discretion, had seen to it that the information would ripple through the village like a dropped stone in a still pond. By 9:30, Holmes and I made our way through the mist-cloaked fields toward Blackwell's abandoned cottage, each carrying a satchel of supplies. The night was cold, the mist swirling in heavy tendrils around our boots. Above us, a few hard stars pierced the gloom. Holmes moved with a silent purpose, his silhouette long and lean beneath the folds of his dark coat. I, for my part, clutched my revolver tightly in my coat pocket, my nerves taut with anticipation. Gittichin cottage loomed ahead, a squat and lonely shape against the mist. Holmes produced a key he had obtained earlier from Inspector Garrow, and opened the door with barely a whisper. Inside, the air was stale with disuse, and the faint smell of smoke lingered. We entered cautiously. Holmes set about arranging the scene with meticulous care. A lamp burned low in the front room, a battered satchel placed conspicuously upon the table. Within it, in place of the supposed journal, he had packed a few weighty ledgers and random papers to give the bag substance. "There," he said softly, surveying his handiwork. "An irresistible morsel for our would-be thief." "And us?" I asked. Holmes gestured to the narrow pantry door off the kitchen. "A perfect vantage point. We shall wait there, and when the fox enters the henhouse, we shall spring." The hours passed with aching slowness. We crouched in the cramped pantry, breathing shallowly, the darkness wrapping itself around us like a second skin. Outside, the wind stirred the hedges and rattled the eaves. I strained my ears for every creak, every scrape. At intervals, I glanced sideways at Holmes, whose pale profile remained utterly still, the very model of patience. It was shortly after 1 in the morning when the latch on the front door gave a soft, almost imperceptible click. Holmes's hand tensed upon my arm. We listened as slow, deliberate footsteps crossed the threshold. Whoever it was, they moved with the caution of someone deeply aware of the danger of being heard. Through the thin crack of the pantry door, I glimpsed a figure, tall, lean, wrapped in a dark greatcoat. A scarf was wound around the lower half of his face, and he wore gloves despite the relative mildness of the evening. In his hand, he carried a short, wicked-looking crowbar. He approached the table with quick, economical movements, his gloved fingers reaching for the satchel. Holmes burst from the pantry like a striking hawk. "Hold it right there!" he barked. The intruder recoiled, but only for a heartbeat. With a snarl, he swung the crowbar in a vicious arc toward Holmes's head. I was already moving, my revolver raised. "Drop it!" I shouted. The man hesitated, calculating. Then he flung the crowbar at Holmes with surprising force and bolted for the door. Holmes ducked, the crowbar whistling harmlessly past, and gave chase at once. I was 2 steps behind him. As we tore into the night, the fugitive sprinted across the field beyond the cottage, his dark form weaving through the mist. Holmes, though wiry and fast, was hampered by the uneven ground. I fired a shot into the air, hoping to startle the man into halting, but he did not slow. Ahead, the land dipped sharply into a shallow ravine, a tangle of brambles and low stone. "Walls! He's headed for the woods!" Holmes shouted. We redoubled our pace, but the mist thickened, swallowing the man's silhouette. A moment later, we heard a scuffling crash, a cry, and then silence. When we reached the spot, we found the fugitive sprawled awkwardly at the bottom of the ravine, unconscious or worse. His right leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. Holmes knelt swiftly, feeling for a pulse. "He's alive," he said grimly, "but he's broken his leg clean through." With some difficulty, we fashioned a crude stretcher from fallen branches and Holmes's overcoat. Between the 2 of us, we managed to carry the man back to the village. By the time we reached the Swan and Goose, the first light of dawn was silvering the horizon. Holmes dispatched a boy to fetch Inspector Garrow, while I tended to the fugitive's injuries as best I could. When Garrow arrived, bleary-eyed but alert, Holmes wasted no time. "Our burglar," he said, "caught in the act." Garrow peered at the unconscious man and grunted. "Who is he?" "We shall find out soon enough," Holmes replied. Within the hour, a village doctor had set the man's leg and administered a dose of laudanum to ease the pain. As the drug wore off, the fugitive roused, blinking groggily up at us. Holmes loomed. Over him, his face impassive. "Your name?" he asked. The man sneered but said nothing. Holmes crouched beside him, lowering his voice to a dangerous softness. "You are in serious trouble. Assault, burglary, resisting arrest. Cooperate now, and it may go easier for you later." The man's bravado crumbled. He sighed heavily. "Name's Carter," he muttered. "Philip Carter." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And who sent you here tonight, Mr. Carter?" The man hesitated. Holmes leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "Let me guess. You were paid handsomely to retrieve a certain journal belonging to the late Arthur Blackwell." Carter's lips twisted. Didn't know what was in it. Didn't care. Just knew it was worth something. "Who hired you?" Holmes pressed. Carter stared sullenly at the ceiling. Holmes rose. "No matter. You have already told me enough." Inspector Garrow ordered Carter placed under guard, and as the morning unfolded, Holmes and I retired briefly to our rooms to wash and change. Over a late breakfast, Holmes considered the matter aloud. Carter is a pawn, nothing more. Hired muscle to do the dirty work. His employer remains unknown. But Carter's description of the man matches Rowntree's visitor closely. "The man with the silver fox cane," I said. "Precisely. We are closing in, Watson, but we must tread carefully. The true mastermind is still at large and growing increasingly desperate." "What's our next move?" I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Set another trap, but this time we shall cast a wider net." He leaned forward, tapping his long fingers upon the table. "Shall need to visit London briefly. There are certain resources there that may aid our cause. You, meanwhile, must remain here and watch carefully. Report any unusual activity at once. When do you leave? I asked. Within the hour. And with that, Holmes rose, his mind already racing ahead to the next move in the deadly chess game unfolding before us. As he gathered his things and prepared for departure, I felt a familiar thrill course through me. The pieces were moving swiftly now, and the endgame, though still obscured by mist and deception, was drawing nearer. Chapter 6. A Visitor in the Fog. The village wore a heavy, brooding silence after Holmes's departure. I watched him vanish into the mist on the morning coach to London. A tall figure hunched against the cold, his satchel tucked securely under his arm. I was left with instructions to keep a vigilant eye on the village, and to expect the unexpected. Occupied myself throughout the day with small investigations. I revisited Blackwell's cottage, examining its surroundings anew, and spoke quietly with the villagers, gathering stray pieces of gossip. Yet, despite my efforts, no new clues materialized. The atmosphere, however, had shifted subtly. A tension hung in the air, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The Swan and Goose remained my headquarters. By evening, I had returned to the familiar warmth of its low-ceilinged sitting room, a fire crackling in the hearth and a pint of bitter untouched at my elbow. I was reading one of Holmes's monographs on poisons, an attempt to better understand the curious chemical traces found on Blackwell's beekeeping gloves, when the door creaked open. A man stepped inside, bringing a draught of chill mist with him. He was of average height, well-dressed, with a bowler, hat pulled low over his forehead. His coat was of fine wool, and his gloves, grey suede, were too elegant for rural life. His face was lean and sharply featured, the mouth thin and watchful. He paused for a moment, scanning the room, before approaching my table. "Dr. John Watson?" he asked in a soft, cultivated voice. I rose warily. "Yes. And you are?" He offered a polite, almost deferential smile. "My name is Simon Travers. I was told you are investigating the death of Arthur Blackwell." I studied him keenly. His clothes bore no mud or travel stains. He had not come far, yet I had never seen him in the village before. "I am assisting Sherlock Holmes," I said carefully. "May I ask your business?" Travers removed his gloves with precise movements. "I was acquainted with Mr. Blackwell some years ago, in London. We shared a certain professional interest." "And what was that?" Travers hesitated, glancing around. The sitting room was empty save for us, and the sleepy innkeeper behind the bar. "May we speak privately?" he asked. Something about him, perhaps his cautious manner, or the way his eyes flicked constantly toward the door, put me on, alert. Nevertheless, I nodded, and led him to a small private parlour the innkeeper kept for special guests. Once inside, Travers closed the door with deliberate care. "I believe Mr. Blackwell's death was no accident," he said without preamble, stiffened. "What leads you to that conclusion?" He drew a small object from his pocket, a vial sealed tightly with wax. "I received this from Blackwell 2 weeks before his death. A sample of a new toxin he claimed to have synthesized from certain exotic plants. He warned me it was highly unstable. I took the vial gingerly. The liquid inside was a murky green, viscous and faintly luminous even in the dim light. He feared, Travers continued, that others might seek to steal his formula. He was planning to patent his discovery, a potentially lucrative endeavour. "And you think someone killed him for it?" I asked. Travers's mouth tightened. "I know it." There was something almost too neat about his presentation, the sudden appearance, the dramatic revelation. Holmes would have distrusted him instantly. "And so did I. May I ask," I said, affecting a casual tone, "why you bring this information now, and not sooner?" Travers's eyes flickered. "I was travelling abroad. I only learned of his death upon my return yesterday. I came immediately. A plausible story, but one that could not be verified at the moment. Do you know if Blackwell had any particular enemies?" I asked. Travers considered. He was cautious, paranoid even. He spoke of a man, he never named him, who had tried to steal his research before. Someone from his time at the Botanical Institute. "And you don't know this man's name?" Travers spread his hands apologetically. "I'm afraid not." I nodded, feigning acceptance. "Thank you, Mr. Travers. Your information may prove invaluable." He stood. "If you should require my assistance further, I am staying at the Red Lion Inn in Crowthorne." He tipped his hat and withdrew, leaving behind a faint trace of expensive cologne. The moment he was gone, I fetched paper and pen. I wrote a telegram to Holmes at once. "Urgent. Man named Simon Travers. Claims connection Blackwell. Toxin story. Suspicious. Investigate." "Watson." Satisfied, I returned to the common room to keep watch. Travers had set off a storm of questions in my mind, and I had no intention of letting him slip away without answers. That night, sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned in my narrow bed, my mind racing with possibilities. At last, around 2 a.m, I gave up the pretence of rest and rose. Pulling on boots and coat, I decided a walk would clear my head. The village was utterly silent. A heavy fog clung to the ground, muffling every sound. I walked aimlessly at first, my breath steaming in the chill air. It was near Blackwell's cottage that I heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps ahead, rapid and furtive. I froze, straining my ears. The footsteps faded, but not before I caught sight of a shadow moving through the mist. A dark shape slipping around the side of the cottage. Instinct took over. I moved as quietly as I could, keeping to the hedgerows. As I approached, I heard the unmistakable sound of a window being forced open. Someone was breaking in. I crept closer, my revolver once more in my pocket. Peering through the mist, I caught a glimpse of the intruder. A man in a dark overcoat, his back to me, struggling with the window latch. A twig snapped under my boot. The man spun around. Even in the dim light, I recognized him, Simon Travers. His eyes widened in shock. For a moment we stared at one another, then he bolted. I gave chase, my heart hammering against my ribs. Travers was fast, but I was younger and fueled by adrenaline. I gained on him rapidly as he sprinted toward the woods. "Stop!" I shouted. Travers stumbled but regained his footing, crashing through the underbrush. A fallen branch caught his ankle. He pitched forward heavily, landing with a grunt. I was on him in an instant, wrenching his arm behind his back and forcing him to his knees. "You're not getting away that easily," I said through gritted teeth. He struggled, but I had the advantage. After a few moments, he sagged in defeat. When I dragged him back to the village square, a few lights were already flickering on in the cottages. The commotion had roused the early risers. Inspector Garrow met us halfway, bleary-eyed and fuming. "What in God's name?" "This man," I said, "was caught breaking into Blackwell's cottage." Garrow's eyes narrowed. He nodded grimly and summoned 2 constables to take Travers into custody. At the Swan and Goose, I sat alone by the fire once more, exhaustion weighing heavily upon me. But my mind was sharper than ever. Travers's game was clear now. He had not come merely to offer information. He had come to retrieve something he believed Blackwell had hidden in that cottage. The vial he had given me earlier was likely a decoy, meant to distract, to buy him time. What secrets still lay hidden in the late Beekeeper's home? And how far would Travers, or his employers, go to obtain them? As I stared into the flickering flames, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: the real danger had only just begun. Chapter 7. Holmes returns with grave news. The dawn after Travers's arrest broke sluggishly, a pale, reluctant light seeping through heavy clouds. I had spent a restless few hours dozing by the fire, too wary to retreat upstairs again. Outside, the village was already astir, word of the midnight commotion having travelled fast. By the time I ventured out, the baker's wife, the butcher's boy, and even old Mrs. Cranley, who hadn't left her hearth since the first frost, were peering from doorways and windows, eager for the latest scandal. At precisely 8 o'clock, as I paced restlessly outside the Swan and Goose, the morning coach from London creaked into view, trailing mist like a bedraggled ghost. From it sprang a figure I recognized at once. Holmes, his lean frame wrapped in his long grey coat, his sharp gaze already scanning the village. He caught sight of me and strode over briskly, his travel bag swinging in one hand. "You have been busy, Watson," he said by way of greeting. His eyes gleamed with a rare, fierce satisfaction. "And you?" I asked, matching his stride as we turned toward the inn. He nodded curtly. "Productive, very productive. But first, this Travers fellow. Tell me everything." Inside the sitting room, over strong coffee and a plate of cold meats, I recounted the events of the previous evening. Travers's unexpected arrival, his story about Blackwell's toxin, the suspicious vial, and finally his botched attempt to break into Blackwell's cottage. Holmes listened without interruption, save for an occasional narrowing of the eyes or a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers under his chin. "Excellent work, my dear Watson. Your instincts were entirely correct. Travers is a wolf in sheep's clothing. And worse, he is not alone." I frowned. "What did you find in London?" Holmes reached into his bag and withdrew a slim folder of papers. I paid a visit to the offices of the Royal Botanical Institute, where Blackwell once worked. It appears that during his tenure he was involved in highly classified research, experiments with rare South American flora, some of which possess astonishing chemical properties. Specifically, one called Flor de Sombra, the shadow flower. Leaned forward, intrigued. "I have heard of it," Holmes continued, "in obscure medical journals. Its alkaloids can induce paralysis, hallucinations, even death, depending on the preparation." Blackwell, it seems, had discovered a way to distill its properties into a stable compound, one both deadly and exceedingly difficult to detect post-mortem. Whistled softly. So he did create a new toxin. Holmes nodded grimly. And the Institute was not pleased when Blackwell attempted to claim the discovery as his own. There were threats, lawsuits, but Blackwell left before matters escalated, retiring here to Witchford, or so it seemed. He tapped the folder meaningfully. I also discovered that 2 months ago, a certain Mr. Simon Travers, formerly a junior researcher at the Institute, suddenly came into a great deal of money. His resignation followed soon after. A bribe? I suggested. Or a payment for services rendered, Holmes said. In any case, Travers's sudden reappearance here is no coincidence. He has been sent, or hired, to recover Blackwell's notes, his formula, or the compound itself. Then Travers is working for... Holmes's lips thinned, the highest bidder, I suspect, and not necessarily one interested in botanical advancement. Imagine, Watson, what a weapon such a toxin could be in the wrong hands. Undetectable, swift and certain. A cold shiver ran down my spine. But Blackwell is dead. His work is lost. Holmes's smile was thin and humourless. Is it? He rose abruptly, his energy crackling. We must search Blackwell's cottage thoroughly, and quickly. Travers's employers will not sit idle. With their agent now in custody, they may dispatch others. I rose too, the urgency contagious. But will the constabulary allow it? I asked. Holmes gave a rare, mischievous grin. Leave Inspector Garrow to me. Holmes's discussion with Garrow was brief and decisive. Whether by force of argument, reputation, or sheer force of will, Holmes secured permission to conduct a full search of Blackwell's property. Accompanied by 2 grim-faced constables, we made our way to the late Beekeeper's modest stone cottage. The air inside was stale, tinged with the scent of dried herbs and old wax. Holmes prowled from room to room like a hunting cat, his sharp gaze missing nothing. He tapped at the floorboards, examined the walls, lifted carpets, rifled through drawers. Hours passed. Frustration simmered in the air. At last, in the small study at the rear of the house, Holmes's persistence bore fruit. "Watson!" he called, sharply. I hurried to his side. He was crouched by the fireplace, his fingers tracing an irregularity in the mortar above the hearth. With a quick, deft motion, he pressed inward. A section of stone shifted, revealing a hidden recess. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound journal, and a small glass-stoppered bottle filled with a viscous, dark green liquid. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Blackwell's final work, he breathed. He handled both items with reverent care, placing them inside a satchel. "We must examine these in private," he said. But as he straightened, his keen ears caught something, and so did mine. A creak of floorboards, a scuff of movement. Holmes's eyes met mine briefly, grim and alert, without a word. He extinguished the lamp on the desk, plunging the room into shadow. Another creak, closer. Holmes moved silently to the doorframe, peering down the hall. I edged toward the window, pulling back the curtain a fraction. Outside, 2 shadowy figures loomed near the garden gate, crouched low. "They are already here," Holmes whispered. The realization sent a jolt through me. We had recovered Blackwell's secrets mere minutes ahead of our adversaries. Holmes assessed the situation coolly. "We cannot risk a direct confrontation," he murmured, "not with the formula in hand. We must slip out unseen." "How?" I breathed. He pointed to the narrow back window overlooking the apiary. "Quickly!" I squeezed through first, landing softly among the abandoned beehives. Holmes followed, a heartbeat later, tucking the satchel securely under his coat. Keeping low, we moved swiftly across the overgrown garden, circling wide around the figures at the gate. Their attention was fixed on the cottage, unaware of our escape. Holmes led the way into the woods beyond, moving with uncanny sure-footedness, even in the gathering gloom. Only once we had put a quarter-mile between ourselves and the cottage did he allow us to pause. There, hidden among the trees, Holmes permitted himself a tight smile. "For once, fortune has favoured us, Watson." I let out a breath I hadn't realised I was holding. "And now?" I asked. Holmes tapped the satchel. "Now, we study Blackwell's journal. We must know precisely what he discovered, and who might kill to possess it." Back at the Swan and Goose, in the privacy of my upstairs room, we examined the fruits of our daring recovery. The journal was dense, filled with chemical formulae, botanical observations, and meticulous notes. Holmes skimmed rapidly, his eyes flashing with excitement. "Extraordinary," he murmured. "What does it say?" Holmes pointed to a passage. "Blackwell perfected a method to distill flor de sombra into a substance absorbable through the skin. Hence the importance of the beekeeping gloves. A mere touch could prove lethal. A chill stole over me. That explains the residue we found on the gloves." Holmes nodded, and suggests that Blackwell did not die by accident at all. He was poisoned, most likely deliberately. He turned to another page. Further, Blackwell feared his discovery would fall into corrupt hands. He wrote of offers made in darkness and men who would see empires fall for a vial. My blood ran cold. Who are they? Holmes's mouth tightened. "That, Watson, is the riddle we must solve. Quickly." He rose, slipping the journal back into the satchel. "We must move at once. This village is no longer safe." "But where?" Holmes's smile was grim and bright. "To London, to the heart of the storm." Chapter 8. A Perilous Journey. We left the Swan and Goose under cover of the dense evening fog. Holmes, satchel secured beneath his coat, led the way through Whichford's narrow, crooked lanes, avoiding the pools of light that spilled from the few occupied houses. The village had sunk into an uneasy slumber, but Holmes's urgency suggested the danger was far from over. We made for the modest train station at the edge of town. The late-night goods train, bound for London by a slow and winding route, would be our passage. Holmes had judged rightly that any express or coach would be closely watched. As we walked, he spoke in low, urgent tones. "Our adversaries will know soon enough that Travers has failed. When they discover the cottage has been searched and the prize is gone, they will not assume it was local police. They will guess that someone more capable has intervened, and they will act accordingly." I nodded grimly, pulling my coat tighter against the damp chill. "Do you think they'll pursue us?" Holmes gave a slight, humourless laugh. "My dear Watson, I would be astonished if they were not already trying to intercept us." The station, a solitary platform with a single flickering gas lamp, was deserted save for a half-asleep station-master dozing in his booth. The rails stretched into darkness in both directions, gleaming faintly like the scales of some slumbering serpent. Holmes slipped a shilling to the station-master, murmuring a request for 2 tickets to London under assumed names. As we waited, Holmes stood motionless, his head tilted slightly, as if listening for some sound carried by the mist. I strained my ears but heard nothing beyond the distant sigh of the wind. Minutes later, the low rumble of an approaching train stirred the mist into swirling eddies. A single engine and 2 battered carriages rattled into view, squealing and hissing as it slowed to a stop. We boarded without fanfare, choosing an empty compartment at the rear. Holmes slid the door shut, drew the curtains, and positioned himself where he could see both the entrance and the passing landscape through a narrow gap. The train lurched into motion, pulling us slowly into the night. For a time, silence reigned between us. I watched Holmes's face, lit dimly by the occasional passing lamp. His features were composed, but the tension in his shoulders spoke volumes. I dared break the silence. Holmes, do you truly believe this matter is so grave?" He turned to me, and for a moment I glimpsed a seriousness in his gaze that few ever saw. "Watson," he said quietly, "if the substance in Blackwell's vial were to fall into the wrong hands, it would be a weapon more dreadful than any gun or knife, a touch unseen, a death without trace. Political assassinations, the silent collapse of governments. It is no exaggeration to say it could alter the fate of nations." I swallowed hard. But who are these men pursuing it? Criminals? Holmes's mouth twisted. Some, perhaps, but others? Agents of foreign powers, secret factions within our own empire. Men who operate in shadows beyond the reach of law or reason. There are always those who covet such power. He fell silent again, staring out into the night. We had travelled perhaps 20 miles when it happened. The compartment door rattled and a figure tried the handle. Holmes signalled sharply, and we rose to our feet just as the door was forced open with a splintering crack. A man in dark clothing lunged inside, a heavy-set fellow with a brutal face and a cudgel raised high. Holmes moved. With lightning speed, he sidestepped the blow, seized the man's wrist, and twisted it savagely. The cudgel clattered to the floor. Before the intruder could react, Holmes drove a precise blow to his temple, and the man collapsed in a heap. Before I could recover from my astonishment, another figure appeared behind him, a wiry man with a knife flashing in his hand. This one was quicker. Holmes grappled with him, and the two struggled fiercely. I sprang forward, grabbing the man's arm as he tried to bring the blade to bear. Between the two of us, we managed to wrench the weapon away and subdue him. Holmes pulled a length of cord from his pocket, ever prepared, and bound the two men securely. He turned to me, breathing hard but composed. "Well done, Watson." He searched the unconscious men's pockets with swift efficiency, producing a handful of curious items. A map of the railway line, a note with our assumed names scrawled upon it, and a small vial of dark liquid. Holmes held up the vial grimly. "Poison," he said. "They meant to ensure we did not reach London alive." I stared at the two bound forms with a new sense of unease. How did they find us? Holmes shrugged. A bribe to a careless official, a lucky guess. Or perhaps they had been watching Witchford for days, knowing Blackwell would not keep his secret forever. He considered for a moment. We must assume there are more of them. It is imperative that we vanish from their sight. Holmes paced briefly, thinking, then glanced out the window. The train was slowing again, approaching a rural siding. Without hesitation, Holmes flung open the compartment door and dragged the two unconscious men into the corridor. He bundled them into a broom closet near the lavatory, locking it with a spare key. He turned back to me, face grim. "We must get off here, Watson. Come." I followed without question. As the train slowed to a crawl past an unlit platform, Holmes opened the carriage door and leapt lightly onto the gravel. Followed, landing awkwardly but safely. The train clattered away into the mist, leaving us alone in the dark. Holmes consulted his pocket compass and gestured toward a narrow cart track leading into the woods. "This way." We set off at a brisk pace, plunging into the trees. The woods were thick and oppressive, the darkness so complete that I could scarcely see Holmes a yard ahead. Twigs snapped underfoot, and unseen branches clawed at our clothing. My heart hammered with every step, expecting, at any moment, the crack of a pistol or a knife in the dark. But Holmes moved steadily, as though he knew the way. At last, after what felt like an eternity, we emerged onto a country road. A faint glimmer of light showed ahead. A coaching inn, its sign creaking in the wind. Holmes smiled grimly. "Providence favours us, Watson. A fresh team and a carriage, and we may yet reach London before our enemies." Inside, the sleepy innkeeper was only too happy to rent us a trap and a pair of sturdy horses. Within minutes we were rattling down the darkened road at a brisk trot, Holmes handling the reins with surprising skill. As the miles rolled away under the wheels, Holmes grew more relaxed, though the satchel never left his side. By dawn, the lights of London's outskirts appeared on the horizon, blurred and shimmering through the lifting mist. Holmes turned to me, a gleam of satisfaction in his weary eyes. "We have survived the first gauntlet, my dear Watson." He flicked the reins, urging the horses faster. "But the true battle is just beginning." At Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson greeted us with open-mouthed astonishment, for we were both mud-spattered, bruised and dishevelled. Holmes brushed aside her exclamations. "Hot coffee, Mrs. Hudson, and if you would, ensure no visitors disturb us today." "None." He led the way to our sitting-room and locked the door behind us. From the satchel he produced Blackwell's journal and the vial of green toxin, placing them carefully on the table. Holmes sank into his armchair with a sigh, steepling his fingers under his chin. "Now, Watson," he said quietly, "we must determine our next move. The formula must be secured beyond reach of any who would misuse it. And to do that, we must first understand precisely who opposes us, and who, if anyone, we can trust." I nodded, feeling a grim determination kindle within me. The game, as Holmes so often said, was afoot. Chapter 9. Threads in the Webby Midday. Holmes had already set in motion a series of inquiries that only a mind as sharp as his could have orchestrated. While I sat reviewing the notes we had made regarding the events at Witchford, Holmes moved briskly about our rooms, dictating telegrams, examining maps, and consulting his well-thumbed index of criminal organizations and known agents. The key, Watson, he said, pausing to strike a match and light his pipe, is to understand not merely who seeks Blackwell's formula, but how they have come to know of its existence at all. I frowned. Surely Travers spoke to someone? Holmes shook his head. Travers was no fool. A violent man, yes, but not a careless one. If we accept that Blackwell entrusted the secret only to his journal, and that journal was concealed until very recently, it becomes clear. There is another hand at work, someone who knew, or guessed, the nature of Blackwell's research long before Travers acted. He exhaled a thin stream of smoke. We are dealing not merely with thieves or murderers, Watson, but with a network, an organized and highly disciplined one. A sharp knock interrupted our conversation. Holmes strode to the door, and after a brief whispered exchange, admitted a short, wiry man with piercing blue eyes, one of his many informants from the labyrinthine underworld of London. The man doffed his cap and shuffled nervously. "Mr. Holmes, sir, I got your message." "Good," Holmes said briskly. "Tell me what you know of unusual movements in London over the past week. Foreign agents, secret meetings, any whispers of large sums changing hands." The man licked his lips. "There's been talk, sir. Quiet-like, you understand. A man come over. From the continent, a Frenchman maybe. Calls himself Leclerc. Some say he's tied to the old Bonapartist lot. Others think he's working for newer masters. He's been meeting with all sorts, diplomats, smugglers, even a few fellows from Parliament." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And what has he been seeking?" The man glanced around nervously before leaning in. "Something chemical, sir. Some secret weapon. Talk is, it could kill a man quick as blinking, leave no trace. The sort of thing governments would pay fortunes for." Holmes nodded slowly. "Where can I find this Leclerc?" "He's been seen at the Black Swan Tavern down Limehouse Way. Private rooms. Keeps a couple of hard men with him, too." Holmes pressed a coin into the informant's hand. "You've done well. If you hear anything more, send word at once." After the man departed, Holmes turned to me, his face alight with grim satisfaction. "There it is, Watson. The web revealed. Leclerc is almost certainly at the centre of this conspiracy. And if so, he may already have agents seeking Blackwell's formula, or worse, preparing to strike at us directly." He rose, reaching for his coat. "We must act before they do. Come, Watson, there is no time to waste." The journey to Limehouse was a perilous one. Though it was daylight, the narrow, grimy streets twisted like arteries through the heart of London's underbelly. The smell of salt, tar, and unwashed humanity lay heavy in the air. Here men disappeared without trace, and law was a distant, impotent thing. We approached the Black Swan cautiously. It was an unremarkable building, a sagging structure with smoke-blackened bricks, and a cracked window bearing a faded sign of a swan in flight. Holmes drew me into a nearby alley, and observed the entrance carefully. "There, Watson, note the sentry." I saw him, a burly man lounging against the wall, ostensibly smoking, but with eyes that missed little. Holmes considered. "We cannot enter openly. We must create a distraction." He surveyed the street, then produced a coin and handed it to a ragged, boy loitering nearby. A sovereign if you start a brawl at the corner," he said with a smile. The boy's eyes lit up. Moments later, shouts and curses erupted down the street as a fistfight broke out among the urchins. The sentry glanced toward the commotion, hesitated, then moved off to investigate. Holmes seized the moment. "Now, Watson!" We slipped inside the Black Swan and hurried down a dim corridor toward the private rooms at the rear. Holmes selected a door and pressed his ear against it. After a moment, he nodded and drew a slender set of lockpicks from his pocket. Within seconds, the lock yielded. We entered a cramped, smoke-filled room. At the table sat 3 men deep in conversation. One, with a sallow complexion and a scar across his cheek, matched the description of Leclerc. Beside him sat a wiry man with cold eyes and a nervous-looking clerk in spectacles. Holmes motioned me to silence. We edged closer. Leclerc was speaking in low, rapid French, but Holmes caught enough to translate for my benefit. The formula must be secured within 2 days. The English detectives are moving faster than anticipated. The buyer arrives from Vienna on Friday. The clerk spoke hesitantly, but if Holmes is involved, Leclerc cut him off with a snarl. Then Holmes must be neutralized. Already our friends have failed once. They will not fail again. Holmes's hand tightened on my arm. His lips moved soundlessly. We must go, but as we turned to slip away, the door behind us creaked loudly. 3 heads snapped around. "Qui est là?" Leclerc barked. We had no choice. Holmes acted first, seizing a heavy pewter jug from the table and hurling it at the lamp. The room plunged into darkness and confusion. I heard curses, the crash of overturned chairs, and the thud of fists striking flesh. Holmes grappled with one of the men, while I found myself fending off the wiry one, who fought like a man possessed. Blows rained down. I staggered under a punch but rallied, driving my opponent back with a well-aimed swing. Somewhere in the chaos, a pistol barked. A bullet sang past my ear and embedded itself in the doorframe. Holmes shouted, "Out, Watson!" We fought our way to the corridor, slamming the door behind us. The wounded lock held for the moment. Panting, we fled through the smoky warren of hallways, emerging at last into the open air. Behind us, shouts of pursuit rang out. Holmes did not pause. He led the way down side streets and alleys, twisting and turning, doubling back, until at last the noise faded behind us. At a safe distance, we stopped to catch our breath. Holmes's eyes were bright with exhilaration. "We have them rattled, Watson. They know we are close, and more importantly, we know when and where the exchange is to occur." He straightened, his expression hardening. "Vienna, Friday. A buyer of significant means, and no doubt little scruple." I brushed dust from my coat, wincing at the bruises already, forming. "What now, Holmes?" He smiled grimly. "Now we set a trap." That evening, Holmes dispatched a series of coded messages to contacts across London. One to Inspector Lestrade, requesting discreet surveillance at Liverpool Street Station, and another to Mycroft Holmes at the Diogenes Club, seeking information on recent arrivals from Austria. As we dined, if one could call it that, on cold meat and stale bread, Holmes outlined his plan. Leclerc will not risk direct negotiation. We'll send an intermediary to meet the buyer. We must intercept that meeting and substitute ourselves." I stared at him. "You mean to pose as sellers?" "Precisely. With the formula as bait, we shall draw the buyer into the open, and perhaps Leclerc himself." I shook my head in admiration at his audacity. "And once we have them?" Holmes's smile was thin and cold. "Then, Watson, we shall pull down the entire rotten edifice." As the city lights flickered against the darkening sky, I felt a surge of excitement. The danger was great, but so too was the prize. And as always, at the heart of the web, Sherlock Holmes waited to spring his trap. Chapter 10. The Dance of Masks. The days that followed were among the most tense I can recall in all my adventures with Sherlock Holmes. Every moment was taut with expectation, every errand laced with danger. Holmes worked tirelessly, arranging the pieces for the performance he intended to stage, a dance of masks and falsehoods that would, if successful, ensnare the conspirators in their own web. Our preparations began with a visit to a small, unremarkable tailor's shop on Fleet Street, a place Holmes had used before when costumes and disguises were required. The tailor, a sprightly, silver-haired man named Griggs, welcomed us with a knowing nod. "I need to appear as a seller of illicit goods," Holmes said without preamble, with a touch of the Continental about me. Griggs smiled, already bustling about his shelves. "Say no more, Mr. Holmes. I have just the thing. A little French cut to the coat, a cravat too wide for an Englishman's taste, and boots that speak of foreign cobblers." Within an hour, Holmes had transformed. The mirror reflected not the consulting detective of Baker Street, but a lean, sharp-eyed figure with a slight Gallic affectation. His hair was slicked back with pomade. A faint strategic smudge darkened his jaw. I too was outfitted, though with less flamboyance, a nondescript assistant, the kind of man who carries cases and opens doors, easily overlooked. "Excellent," Holmes said, adjusting his cravat with satisfaction. "The success of our venture depends on being believed, Watson. A single false note, and we are undone." That evening, Holmes arranged a meeting in a dim, forgotten café near the docks, a place where desperate men plotted desperate deeds. A message was sent through intermediaries to Leclerc's network. The sellers were ready, and the exchange would occur in a neutral location of their choosing. To sweeten the bait, Holmes hinted that rivals were also interested, and delay could cost dearly. "We must make them eager, Watson," he said, steepling his fingers. "Desperation breeds mistakes." It worked. By the next afternoon, a note was delivered by a street urchin. The meeting was set for the following night, in the abandoned warehouse by the Millbank docks. We were to come alone and bring the package. Holmes read the message with satisfaction. Just as I hoped, they seek isolation, they seek control, but in their haste they have given us the advantage. The appointed night was cold and clear, the stars sharp against the velvet sky. We made our way to Millbank under the cover of darkness, avoiding the pools of gaslight, our steps muffled against the damp stones. The warehouse loomed ahead, a gaunt skeleton of rotting wood and rusted iron. The river lapped quietly against. The quay, a soothing counterpoint to the tension coiled in my gut. Holmes glanced at me. "Ready, Watson?" I nodded, my hand brushing the butt of the revolver concealed beneath my coat. Inside, The warehouse was a cavern of shadows. Moonlight filtered through broken panes high above, casting lattices of silver on the floor. The air smelled of salt, decay, and the faint, sharp tang of oil. Holmes led the way to the centre of the vast space, where a crate had been placed. Our package. In truth, it was filled with nothing more than scraps of paper and sand. But to our adversaries, it would appear to be the precious formula they sought. Minutes crawled by, then footsteps. Figures emerged from the gloom. 4 of them. 3 were broad-shouldered men, with the unmistakable posture of professional ruffians. Between them walked a slender, elegant man in a dark cloak, Leclerc himself. He approached with the easy confidence of one accustomed to command. "You have the goods?" he said, his English tinged with French vowels. Holmes, now fully in character, gave a slight bow. "Indeed, monsieur, but first payment." Leclerc smiled thinly. "Of course." He gestured, and one of his men produced a satchel, opening it to reveal neat stacks of banknotes. Half now, half when the contents are verified. Holmes shrugged as if indifferent, and stepped forward to examine the money. At that moment, a faint sound reached my ears, too faint for most, but Holmes had taught me to listen. Click. The unmistakable sound of a pistol being cocked. It was a trap. I moved instinctively, drawing my revolver. Holmes reacted just as swiftly. He overturned the crate, scattering sand and paper, creating a cloud of confusion. Shots rang out, echoing like thunderclaps in the cavernous space. I fired at a shadow rushing toward me, heard a grunt, and ducked behind a support beam. Holmes grappled with one of the ruffians, using speed and precision rather than brute strength. Leclerc cursed in French, retreating toward the shadows. I saw him and gave chase. The warehouse became a nightmare warren of beams, crates, and shifting light. I glimpsed Leclerc's cloak fluttering ahead, heard the slap of his boots on the wooden floor. "Stop!" I shouted, but he only ran faster. Behind me, the fight raged on. Holmes, I knew, could handle himself. My task was clear. Leclerc must not escape. I pursued him through a broken side door and into the night. Outside, the dock stretched wide and empty, silvered by moonlight. Leclerc sprinted toward a waiting boat, where 2 shadowy figures bent over. Oars. I fired a warning shot into the air. Leclerc hesitated. That was enough. With a burst of speed I scarcely knew I possessed, I reached him, tackling him hard. We crashed to the ground, struggling. He was surprisingly strong, writhing and twisting like a snake. His hand darted toward his belt, where a dagger gleamed. I struck him across the jaw with the butt of my revolver. He slumped unconscious. Breathing heavily, I bound his hands with a length of rope I found on a bollard. Moments later, Holmes appeared, limping slightly, but otherwise unscathed. "You are improving, Watson," he said with a smile. "Not without considerable effort," I panted. Holmes surveyed the unconscious Leclerc with satisfaction. "An admirable catch. With him in our custody, the rest will crumble." From the warehouse, police whistles shrilled. Holmes had arranged for Lestrade and his men to close in once we made our move. Sure enough, figures in uniform soon flooded the AIM docks, rounding up the remaining conspirators. Inspector Lestrade himself approached. his round face alight with satisfaction. "Fine work, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. We have them all, the whole lot." Holmes inclined his head. "Good, but see that Leclerc is held in strict security. His friends may yet try to free him." Lestrade nodded grimly. "You can count on it." Later, back at Baker Street, Holmes relaxed in his chair, a glass of brandy in hand. "The first act is over," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "The first act? Surely with Leclerc arrested, the matter is settled." Holmes smiled thinly. "On the contrary, Watson. Leclerc is but one hand of a greater body. His employer, the true spider at the centre of the web, remains unknown." He sipped his brandy thoughtfully. "I have my suspicions. There are whispers of certain factions abroad, men who would stop at nothing to secure a weapon like Blackwell's." He rose and paced. "No, my dear Watson. We have won a battle, but the war remains. Until we know who stands behind Leclerc, Blackwell's secret is still in danger." I watched him, a familiar thrill of anticipation stirring within me. The dance of masks was far from over, and Sherlock Holmes, master of the hidden and the unseen, was already preparing for the next step. Chapter 11. The Spider's Web. The days that followed Leclerc's capture were quiet, but only in appearance. Behind the peaceful facade of London streets, a storm was brewing, and Holmes was intent on uncovering the storm's true source. His mind, sharp as ever, continued to churn through the details we had gathered. A puzzle, once seemingly complete, had now splintered into countless unknowns. I watched him closely, noting his preoccupation with the case. He had dismissed all visitors from his mind, even Dr. Watson, in favour of pacing, reading through an endless parade of telegrams, and re-examining the crime scene photos we had collected. There was something deeper at play, something we had missed. "Watson," Holmes said abruptly, breaking the silence that had settled over us, "we have overlooked something crucial." I looked up from the papers I had been reviewing. "What is it, Holmes?" Tapped his fingers lightly on the armrest of his chair. "Leclerc may have been the one pulling the strings, but he is not the mastermind behind it all. No, the plot stretches far beyond him. I suspect we are dealing with a network, an organization, of far greater scope." I leaned forward. "An organization, you say? What makes you so certain?" Holmes smiled slightly, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of discovery. "Simple deductions, Watson. The very structure of Leclerc's operation reeks of professionalism. Dendecourt, precision, the timing. It speaks of careful orchestration. Leclerc was merely a soldier, one of many cogs in a far larger machine." "And the beekeeper?" I asked. "How does he fit into this? Was he simply a victim of their machinations?" Holmes's gaze darkened. "Not a victim, Watson. The beekeeper was a pawn, yes, but he had his own role to play. He knew more than we originally thought. He was meant to be eliminated once he outlived his usefulness, but something went wrong. He became more of a liability than an asset." I mulled over Holmes's words. So, if he wasn't just a victim, then what was his role? Holmes rose from his chair, his voice gaining intensity. "The beekeeper was not just anyone, Watson. He was part of a larger, more dangerous conspiracy. The formula that Leclerc and his associates were after. It wasn't merely a piece of intellectual property. It was a weapon." "A weapon?" I echoed, the weight of his words sinking in. But why would someone want a weapon from a beekeeper? Holmes's expression turned grim. Because this was no ordinary beekeeper. He was a chemist, Watson. A brilliant one, though perhaps his genius was veiled beneath his unassuming profession. The formula he was working on had potential, great potential. I frowned. But why kill him for it? Surely the formula could have been acquired without resorting to murder. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and he spoke with a rare vehemence. Because, Watson, not all secrets can be stolen through simple negotiation. Sometimes people are a threat simply by possessing knowledge, and when that knowledge is of such power, the stakes become much higher. I nodded, absorbing the gravity of his words. So, you believe the beekeeper's death was a deliberate attempt to silence him before he could share his discoveries? Exactly, Holmes replied, his voice almost a whisper. And what's more, I believe that the conspiracy goes back further than we anticipated. There are whispers of foreign interests involved. Powers that have been watching this discovery for some time, and they will stop at nothing to gain control of it. Holmes sat back down, steepling his fingers. There is one final thing we must consider, Watson. Leclerc was a mere agent, but who was his superior? Who was the true mastermind behind the plot? I could sense the weight of the question hanging in the air. If we were to get any closer to solving the case, we needed to find the shadowy figure, pulling the strings. The following day, Holmes and I returned to the scene of the beekeeper's death. The police had long since cleared the area, but the evidence of the struggle still lingered in the air. The ground was soft beneath my boots as I walked the perimeter, my eyes scanning every inch of the space. I could almost hear the echoes of the beekeeper's final moments, his struggle, his fear. Holmes moved with the precision of a surgeon, studying every detail, his mind already piecing together fragments of the puzzle. He stopped at a patch of earth near the beehives and crouched down, inspecting it closely. "Ah," he muttered, "there's something here." I joined him and peered over his shoulder. He was carefully examining a set of faint but distinct footprints leading away from the area. "Someone else was here," he continued. "Someone who didn't belong." "But the police searched the area," I protested. "Surely they would have found these prints." Holmes shot me a glance. "The police, Watson, are not known for their attention to detail. They merely clear the area. But I see what they miss." I knelt down beside him, tracing the edges of the footprints. "They're fresh." "Indeed, and they are not the prints of the beekeeper, nor of Leclerc's men," Holmes said, standing up. "These belong to someone else entirely." "Then who?" I asked, a sense of unease beginning to settle in. Holmes stood up, his face a mask of concentration. "Someone with a very specific interest in our case, Watson. Someone who has been watching it unfold from the shadows." We made our way back to Baker Street, and Holmes immediately set to work. He began digging through his collection of letters, telegrams and reports, each piece of information weaving a more intricate web of suspicion. As I watched him, a thought struck me. "Holmes," I said slowly, "what about the connection between Leclerc and the foreign agents you mentioned earlier? Could there be a connection to the beekeeper's mysterious formula?" Holmes stopped and looked up at me, his eyes gleaming with a new intensity. "Ah, Watson, you're catching up." He paced over to his desk, rifling through a drawer filled with papers. After a moment, he withdrew a thin, yellowed letter, its edges frayed with age. "This," Holmes said, handing it to me, "is a letter from a man named Dr. Franz Weber. I've been tracking his activities for some time. He is a scientist, a brilliant one, if rumours are to be believed, who has made significant advances in chemical weaponry." I stared at the letter. The name was unfamiliar to me, but the implications were enough to make my blood run cold. "Dr. Weber," I repeated, feeling the weight of the name. "What does he have to do with this?" Holmes smiled grimly. "Everything, Watson. Dr. Weber is the man behind Leclerc's employer. He's the one pulling the strings. And it's he who wants the Beekeeper's formula more than anyone else." "Why?" I asked. Holmes placed the letter down with deliberation. "Because the formula is not just a weapon. It's the key to a new form of chemical warfare, one that could change the course of history." I stood in stunned silence. This case, which had begun as a simple murder mystery, was spiralling into something far more dangerous and complex. Holmes, as always, was already 2 steps ahead. We must find Dr. Weber before he can complete his plans, and we must prevent him from obtaining the formula at any cost. I nodded, my mind racing. "Then what's our next step?" Holmes smiled faintly. "We follow the trail, Watson. We find the shadow in the dark, and we expose him to the light. And so we prepared once more for the chase, as the web of conspiracy tightened around us." Chapter 12. The Hidden Hand. The game had shifted. No longer were we merely chasing a murderer. We were hunting a shadow that had woven itself deeply into the fabric of the city's underworld. Dr. Franz Weber, the scientist who had hidden behind the scenes, had now become our true target. The discovery of his involvement only deepened the mystery. Holmes's keen instincts had already begun to draw connections between Weber and the web of events surrounding the Beekeeper's death. But we needed to act swiftly before more lives were caught in the tangle. Holmes had returned to his usual routine of methodical analysis, though there was an air of quiet urgency in his demeanour. We spent the next day at his cluttered desk, surrounded by telegrams and letters, piecing together the fragments of information we had gathered. I had been struck by the revelation that Dr. Weber had likely been overseeing Leclerc's operations from the shadows. But what was his true motive? What was the precise nature of the weapon that the Beekeeper had been working on? Holmes had been particularly intrigued by the Beekeeper's past connections. It seemed that before he had settled into his seemingly peaceful occupation, he had been involved in scientific research, his skills honed in a laboratory far removed from the quiet fields where he cultivated his hives. He had worked with chemicals that could change the very nature of warfare, something that could transform the future of combat. The formula was rumoured to be a compound capable of inducing highly specific biochemical reactions, with applications that could make conventional weaponry obsolete. No wonder it had been deemed a prize worth killing for. Yet, even as Holmes delved into these scientific intricacies, I noticed a growing tension in his demeanour. He wasn't one to rush, but every now and then his brow would furrow, as though he were on the verge of solving a crucial piece of the puzzle. Finally, after a long silence, he spoke. "Weber is a dangerous man, Watson. We've only scratched the surface. There's something more at play here, something that has yet to reveal itself." "Do you think we're getting closer to him?" I asked, leaning forward in my chair. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, but not in the way you might think. The usual method of tracking a criminal by following their movements won't work this time. Weber is too careful, too well hidden. We need to find out who his allies are. They are the key to locating him." I watched as Holmes rifled through a stack of papers, pulling out one particular document. It was a list of names, some familiar, others less so. I glanced over it briefly, but it was the subtle way in which Holmes's fingers paused over one name that caught my attention. "Did you recognize this name?" he asked, tapping his finger on the paper. I leaned in closer. The name in question was Victor Halpin. It wasn't a name I had encountered in our earlier investigations, but it had the ring of a man with considerable influence. I frowned. "No, I don't. Should I?" Holmes looked at me, his expression inscrutable. "Halpin is an industrialist, a man with connections that run deep in various sectors. He has ties to several scientific communities, and I suspect that he is more than just a simple businessman. In fact, I believe he may be the financial backer of Weber's operations." I was intrigued. So, Halpin is one of Weber's patrons. Holmes nodded. "Precisely. And that makes him the next logical step in our investigation. If we can uncover his connections, we may very well find ourselves on Weber's trail." At Holmes's instruction, we set out for a meeting with a source who had promised us information on Halpin's dealings. The man, named Charles Devereux, was a former colleague of mine from my medical days, and he had maintained an interest in the more shadowy corners of society's underbelly. His knowledge of London's most influential figures made him invaluable for our current task. Devereux greeted us at his modest office with a nod. The years had not been kind to him. His sharp features were now softened by time, but his eyes still retained a glimmer of the perceptiveness that had once made him a promising young surgeon. "What brings you two to my neck of the woods?" he asked, pouring 2 glasses of whisky. Though he didn't offer me one, it was a gesture that, while polite, betrayed his desire to keep his distance from whatever business we had brought him into. Holmes wasted no time in getting to the point. "We need information on Victor Halpin. He's involved in something far more dangerous than anyone realizes." Devereux raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Halpin, you say?" "I've heard whispers, but I didn't think anyone would be interested in him. A man like him doesn't make waves. He prefers to stay in the background. But if you're asking about him, I suppose it means he's become a bit more than a figurehead." I caught the subtle shift in Devereux's tone. It was clear he had more to say, but he was choosing his words carefully. Holmes, ever perceptive, didn't press him directly, but merely waited for the man to continue. After a moment of silence, Devereux leaned forward. "Halpin's business is spread across several industries, but he has a particular interest in scientific research. He funds multiple laboratories, some of which are engaged in highly controversial work. Most people would write him off as just another businessman, but I know that he's been involved in some dangerous projects that involve chemical warfare and toxicology." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "And you believe he is connected to Dr. Weber?" Devereux's face tightened. I know he is. I've seen their names on documents together. Halpen's been bankrolling Weber's research for some time. Weber's laboratory is equipped with more than just the usual scientific apparatus. It's a place where real, world-altering discoveries are being made. The type of work that could bring down entire governments if it fell into the wrong hands. I felt a chill run down my spine. The implications were profound. If Weber's research had reached such dangerous heights, we were indeed dealing with a threat far beyond a simple murder case. Holmes stood up, pacing the room. We must find where Halpen and Weber are meeting. If we can discover that, we will be one step closer to stopping whatever it is they're planning. Devereux hesitated before speaking again. There's one other thing you should know. Halpen's been more than just a patron. He's involved in some very shady dealings. There are rumours that he's been selling chemicals to the highest bidder. Nations, underground organisations, anyone willing to pay for his product. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Then it is even more urgent that we stop him before his wares are sold to the wrong hands. Devereux's voice dropped to a whisper. Be careful, Holmes. Halpen's network is vast. He's not a man who'll take kindly to interference. You're playing a dangerous game. Holmes smiled thinly. Danger is what makes this so interesting, my dear Devereux. But thank you for your assistance. I'll be in touch. As we left the office, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. We had uncovered yet another layer of the conspiracy, but it had only deepened the mystery. The closer we got to Dr. Weber and Victor Halpen, the more we realized how far-reaching their influence was. But it was not just their power that worried me. It was the weapon they were attempting to unleash. Holmes was already deep in thought, his mind racing ahead, and I knew that the next steps in our investigation would be pivotal. There was no turning back now. Chapter 13. The web tightens. The investigation had reached a critical juncture. Holmes's mind, ever sharp and methodical, had been consumed by the trail of evidence that we had followed so far. The death of Thomas Penrose, the beekeeper, was no longer a mere murder. It had evolved into something far more insidious. A larger scheme seemed to be unfolding, one that involved dangerous people and dangerous technologies, with Victor Halpen and Dr. Franz Weber at its heart. It was now late evening when Holmes, with his usual air of purposeful energy, gathered his notes in a systematic manner. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the cluttered room in Baker Street. I sat across from him, watching as he arranged the papers with such precision that they could almost have been part of some grand chessboard. Holmes, I began, breaking the silence that had settled between us. Do you think we're any closer to uncovering the full extent of Halpen and Weber's plans? Holmes did not look up immediately. His fingers paused on the papers, and I could see the wheels turning behind his sharp eyes. When he spoke, his voice was low but decisive. We are closer, Watson, but we have yet to uncover the true nature of the weapon they're developing. It's clear that they are both operating under the guise of legitimate business and scientific research, but what they are truly doing is far more dangerous. I leaned forward, intrigued. But how do we know they are linked? How can we be certain it's more than just coincidence? Holmes gave a slight smile, as if he had been waiting for me to ask this question. It's in the details, my dear fellow. The beekeeper's research wasn't just about honey production, as we were initially led to believe. It was a front. Penrose had been experimenting with a chemical compound that could alter the physiological makeup of human beings, potentially creating a biochemical weapon. I felt my stomach tighten at the implication of Holmes's words. A weapon, you say? That's preposterous. What could a beekeeper possibly have to do with such things? Holmes nodded slowly, his gaze distant. That is precisely why Penrose's death was so significant. It was not just a random act of violence, it was a message. Someone did not want his research to see the light of day. But who? I asked, unable to conceal my growing concern. Who could be behind such a thing? Holmes turned to face me fully, his eyes sharp. It's not just about the research, Watson. It's about what Penrose knew. He had become too entangled in something far greater than he realized. There are people, very powerful people, who will stop at nothing to control whatever it is he was working on. I could feel the tension in the room building. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit, but there were gaps, important gaps, that needed to be filled. We must follow the money, Watson, Holmes continued, his tone suddenly firm. We know that Halpern was financing Weber's research, but who else might be involved? Who else stands to gain from such a weapon? I nodded, absorbing the gravity of the situation. The implications were staggering, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that we were not simply dealing with a murder case anymore. We were standing at the edge of something much darker. Holmes rose from his chair and walked over to the window, peering out into the darkened street below. His silhouette was framed by the faint glow of the street lamps outside. The mystery had deepened, but so had the danger. I have a feeling, Watson, Holmes said, his voice now filled with an uncharacteristic intensity, that we are about to uncover the full scope of this conspiracy, and when we do, the consequences will be far-reaching. He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. Tomorrow, we will visit Victor Halpern's estate. I believe it is time to confront him. I could scarcely believe what I was hearing. We were about to confront one of the most powerful men in London. It was a daring move, even for Holmes. But Holmes, I began, do you think it's wise? We don't have all the pieces yet. What if we're walking into a trap? Hertog turned to face me, his expression a study in calm determination. That is exactly why we must act now, Watson. The longer we wait, the more difficult it will be to get to the truth. And the more danger Penrose's research will pose to everyone. With that, he returned to his desk, scribbling a few quick notes on a piece of paper. His mind was already working 1,000 steps ahead. It was a familiar sight, a sight I had witnessed countless times during our years of companionship. The next day arrived far too quickly. We made our way to Halpern's estate early in the morning, arriving in a carriage that rumbled quietly through the streets of London. The grandeur of Halpern's home was evident even from a distance. Set against the backdrop of well-manicured gardens and a towering iron gate, the estate looked more like a fortress than a home. I felt a chill run down my spine as we approached. Holmes remained as composed as ever, his face a mask of confidence, though I could sense the undercurrent of tension in his posture. This was no ordinary visit. We were about to challenge a man who had likely already calculated every possible outcome of this confrontation. The butler who greeted us at the door seemed unsurprised by our arrival. It was as though he had been expecting us. With a simple nod, he ushered us into a large, opulent drawing-room, where Halpin sat behind a polished oak desk. The man himself was as imposing as his estate, a tall, broad-shouldered figure, with sharp features that spoke of an intelligence honed by years of manoeuvring in high society. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." Halpin greeted us with a curt nod, his voice deep and commanding. "What brings you to my home this fine morning?" Holmes wasted no time. "Mr. Halpern, I must admit that I find it rather perplexing that a man of your stature would be involved in the affairs of Dr. Franz Weber. His research, as you are well aware, is highly questionable, to say the least, and yet you have been financing his work for some time." Halpin's lips curled into a tight smile. "I'm afraid you have misunderstood, Mr. Holmes. My interests are purely financial. I simply provide support for those whose work may lead to important scientific breakthroughs." Holmes did not flinch, "and I am certain that these breakthroughs are not without their own set of risks, are they? Risks that might be best kept from the general public." The tension in the room thickened. Halpin's eyes narrowed slightly, but he did not rise to the bait. "I assure you, Mr. Holmes, that any projects I am involved with are entirely legitimate. If you have evidence to the contrary, I suggest you bring it forward." Holmes's gaze never wavered. "I intend to do just that, Mr. Halpin. In fact, I think we have only begun to uncover the truth about your involvement with Dr. Weber and the late Thomas Penrose. The stakes are much higher than you realize." Halpin's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I believe, Mr. Holmes, that you are treading dangerous ground. Be careful where you step." With those words, Halpin's demeanour became cold and distant. But Holmes, undeterred, was ready for whatever came next. Chapter 14. The Game of Shadows. The tension in the grand drawing-room of Victor Halpin's estate was palpable. I could feel it in the very air that surrounded us, thick with the unspoken words, between Holmes and the man who had, until now, seemed like an untouchable figure in London's elite. Halpin's icy demeanour betrayed nothing of his true feelings, but I could sense the faintest crack in his otherwise polished exterior, a vulnerability, however slight. Holmes stood firm, his sharp eyes never leaving Halpin's face. There was no mistaking that we were on the precipice of something much larger than we had anticipated. The way Halpin had dismissed our inquiry, brushing it off with vague assurances and a veiled threat, suggested that there was far more to the situation than met the eye. We were no longer dealing with a simple murder mystery. We were confronting a network of power, influence, and secrets that could topple empires. Holmes broke the silence, his voice smooth and unyielding. "You're a man of great influence, Mr. Halpin. It would be a shame if that influence were to be undermined by your association with Dr. Weber and his questionable activities." Halpin's lips tightened, his eyes flickering with a brief flash of annoyance. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his broad chest. "I do not appreciate your insinuations, Mr. Holmes. I assure you, Dr. Weber's work is entirely legitimate. My involvement is purely in the realm of business. Nothing more." Holmes smiled faintly. "Business, yes, but with an unusual flair for the dangerous. You see, I've been following the trail of Dr. Weber's research for some time, and I believe that Penrose, your late beekeeper, had a very good reason for turning against you both. Halpin's gaze turned cold, and for a moment I could see the faintest hint of something darker lurking beneath his composed exterior. Penrose was a fool, he spat, his tone sharper now. He thought he could control the science. He thought his research could rival Weber's. He had no understanding of what he was meddling with. He paid the price for his ignorance. I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. There it was. Halpin's true nature revealed in that one statement. He was willing to discard anyone who stood in his way, regardless of the cost. And now we had crossed that line. Holmes, however, remained unfazed. It seems that Penrose's death was not the result of a simple robbery gone wrong, as we were initially led to believe. No, Mr. Halpin, it was a calculated message, one that told us we were getting too close to the truth. Halpin's face remained a mask of stoic indifference, but his fingers tightened on the arms of his chair. The slightest tremor in his hand was all the evidence Holmes needed. "Do you think I'm afraid of your threats, Holmes?" Halpin's voice was now low and controlled, but I could hear the underlying menace in his words. "You should be careful what you imply. You have no idea what you're up against." Holmes's response was measured calm, and yet it carried the weight of an unspoken promise. "I have a very good idea, Mr. Halpin. I've seen this game before. Men like you, hiding behind wealth and influence, thinking they are invincible. But your empire is built on lies, and the truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how hard you try to suppress it." The room fell silent, the tension thick as smoke. I could sense that Halpin was wrestling with himself, trying to decide whether to show us the extent of his true power, or to dismiss us as irrelevant nuisances. In the end, it seemed that he chose neither. Instead, he stood up abruptly, signalling an end to our conversation. "You will leave now," he said, his voice hard. "I have no time to entertain your baseless accusations. If you believe you can expose me, you are gravely mistaken." Holmes's eyes never wavered from Halpin's form, even as the man turned away, signalling the end of our meeting. I don't need to expose you, Mr. Halpin," Holmes replied with a quiet confidence. "You've already done that yourself." We left the estate without further words, the heavy weight of Halpin's threats lingering in the air between us. As we made our way back to Baker Street, I couldn't help but wonder whether Holmes's words had struck a nerve with Halpin. The man was powerful, yes, but he had shown an almost unnatural anxiety when faced with the truth. There was something more to this situation, something hidden beneath the surface that we had yet to uncover. When we arrived back at our familiar flat on Baker Street, Holmes wasted no time. He immediately began pacing back and forth, his mind already racing ahead to the next step of the investigation. I could tell that something was brewing in his thoughts, something big, something that would change the course of our inquiry. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, stopping in his tracks, "I believe we've been looking at this all wrong. It's not just about Weber and Halpin. It's about the wider implications of their work." I raised an eyebrow. "The wider implications?" Holmes nodded. Indeed, Penrose's research was never just a scientific curiosity. It was a key to something far more dangerous. Penrose had stumbled upon something that could change the balance of power in ways we can't even begin to comprehend, and Halpin and Weber will stop at nothing to control it. I frowned, still unsure of where Holmes was heading. But what exactly are they trying to control, Holmes? What is it they're after? Holmes's eyes gleamed with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. A weapon, Watson! A weapon that could alter the course of history. A weapon disguised as scientific research, but one that could destroy lives on an unimaginable scale. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. A weapon? The very idea seemed absurd, and yet the pieces were beginning to fit together. Penrose had been killed not for his research itself, but for what it could become in the wrong hands. And those hands were now in the possession of men like Halpin and Weber. Holmes's voice interrupted my thoughts. We need to gather more information, Watson. We need to go back to Penrose's farm and see if we can find something, anything, that links Halpin, Weber, and Penrose's work together. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. We were standing at the edge of a discovery that could shake the very foundations of society. But with that discovery came a price that I was no longer certain we were ready to pay. The game was afoot, and the stakes had never been higher. Chapter 15. The Final Clue. The morning fog clung to the ground as Holmes and I arrived at Penrose's farm, our hearts heavy with anticipation. We had only one task left, to find the missing link between Halpin, Weber, and Penrose's mysterious research. Holmes was determined, his sharp eyes scanning every corner of the farm, every piece of debris. As we ventured into the old barn, Holmes stopped in his tracks. On a dusty workbench lay a series of handwritten notes, hastily scrawled but unmistakable in their significance. One phrase caught his eye: the hive protocol. Holmes's expression darkened. This, Watson, is what they were after. The key to their entire operation. The implications were chilling. The hive protocol was no mere scientific breakthrough. It was a weapon, one that could change the course of history. And now we had to stop it before it was too late. The fog had thickened by the time we left Penrose's farm, our minds racing with the implications of what we had uncovered. The phrase, the hive protocol, rang in my ears like a death knell. I could see the urgency in Holmes's every movement as he made his way back to our Baker Street flat. Whatever Penrose had discovered, it was clear that both Weber and Halpin had been desperately trying to control it. Control something that had the potential to reshape everything we knew. As we entered our familiar flat, Holmes immediately made his way to his desk, his fingers moving quickly across the pages of Penrose's notes. I watched him closely, waiting for some revelation, some insight that would lead us to the next step. The silence between us was heavy, but I could tell Holmes was processing something far beyond what I could comprehend. "Watson," he said suddenly, without looking up from the notes, "what do you know of the so-called hive mind theory?" I paused, considering the question. Hive mind theory? I believe it refers to the collective consciousness of a group, be it bees, ants, or even human society. The idea that individuals can operate with shared thoughts, goals, and behaviors, even without direct communication. But what does that have to do with Penrose's work? Holmes lifted his eyes to meet mine, his expression grave. Everything, Watson. Penrose wasn't just studying bees in the conventional sense. He was researching the very nature of collective behavior, how a group of individuals could work in unison, even without conscious awareness of one another's actions. And he found a way to replicate that process. Within humans, I frowned. Replicate it? How? Holmes paused, his fingers tapping on the table as he considered his next words. Penrose discovered a chemical compound, one that could influence the brain's neural activity, enabling individuals to become part of a larger collective consciousness. In essence, they could become like bees in a hive, all working together towards a common goal. But, and this is the most dangerous part, this protocol could be controlled. With the right influence, an individual could be made to follow orders. Without question, it would be like having an army of mindless automatons all linked together with one person at the helm. I felt a chill run down my spine. The implications were staggering. If such a chemical compound existed, it would be a weapon unlike any the world had ever seen. An army of people completely under the control of a single individual, a thought too horrific to even entertain. But Holmes, why would Halpern and Weber want this? Surely they must understand the dangers involved. Holmes sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. That, Watson, is precisely why we are in such danger. Halpern, for all his wealth and power, is a man obsessed with control. He sees himself as a god, a ruler above all others. Weber, on the other hand, is driven by an insatiable thirst for scientific discovery, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone in the pursuit of knowledge. Together, they could create a weapon, one that could give them dominion over not just a single nation, but the entire world. I stared at Holmes in disbelief, my mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what he was saying. The Hive Protocol was not merely an academic pursuit or a scientific curiosity. It was a weapon of mass control, one that could destroy the very fabric of free will itself. So, what do we do now? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Chapter 16. The Hive. Protocol Holmes stood, his eyes narrowing with a mix of determination and resolve. We stop them, Watson. Whatever it takes, we stop them. With that, Holmes grabbed his coat and hat, moving with purpose towards the door. I followed, closely behind, my thoughts a whirl of conflicting emotions, fear, confusion, and the heavy weight of responsibility. The fate of not only our nation, but possibly the entire world, now rested on our shoulders. We made our way through the busy streets of London, the clatter of horses' hooves, and the chatter of the crowd barely registering as we hurried towards our destination. Holmes had decided that our next course of action was to confront Dr. Weber directly. If anyone knew the true nature of the Hive Protocol and its potential, it was him. Halpern was the financier, the mastermind pulling the strings, but it was Weber who held the scientific knowledge to make the protocol a reality. The laboratory was located on the outskirts of London, a stark, sterile building tucked away from the prying eyes of the public. As we arrived, Holmes's gaze was fixed firmly on the door, his mind already working through the myriad possibilities of what we might find inside. "Remember, Watson," Holmes said, his voice low and controlled, "Weber is not just a scientist. He is a man driven by ambition. Do not underestimate him." I nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. We were not just investigating a murder or a theft. We were facing a man capable of changing the course of history. Holmes knocked, firmly on the door of the laboratory, his sharp raps echoing in the quiet of the street. There was a long pause before the door opened slightly, revealing a pair of piercing eyes behind the crack. "Yes," the voice from inside called, cautious yet curious. "We have questions for Dr. Weber." Holmes replied evenly. The door opened, wider, and there, standing in the doorway, was Dr. Weber himself. He was a man of average height, with a thin, gaunt face framed by unkempt dark hair. His appearance, however, belied the sharpness of his mind. The flicker of recognition in his eyes suggested that he knew exactly who we were and why we had come. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Weber greeted us coldly. "To what do I owe the pleasure of your visit? We have reason to believe that you, Dr. Weber, have been involved in a matter far more serious than mere scientific inquiry," Holmes said, his voice calm but firm. "You and your associate, Mr. Halpin, have been manipulating Penrose's research for your own gain, and we believe you've been working on something much more dangerous than you realize." Weber's eyes flashed with something between amusement and annoyance. "Dangerous? You misunderstand, Mr. Holmes. The hive protocol is nothing more than a breakthrough in neural science, a way to understand the deeper connections of the human mind. It is not a weapon, as you claim." Holmes stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Weber's. "And yet you've kept it hidden, even from your colleague Halpin. Why?" Weber hesitated, the smallest of cracks appearing in his composure. It was all Holmes needed. "Because, Mr. Holmes," Weber said slowly, "the truth is far more complicated than you could possibly understand. The hive protocol could change everything, or destroy it." Holmes's eyes glinted with the sharpness of a blade. "We intend to stop it, Doctor, and we will not allow you to succeed." Weber's expression faltered for the briefest of moments. Then, with a flick of his hand, he motioned for us to come inside. "You may think you can stop me, Holmes, but you are already too late." Chapter 17. The Shadow of the Hive. The moment we entered Dr. Weber's laboratory, I felt a strange unease settle in the pit of my stomach. The walls were lined with glass tanks, each filled with a pulsing, translucent fluid, within which rested what appeared to be various mechanical devices and intricate contraptions. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, and the hum of distant machines created a rhythmic, almost hypnotic background noise. It was a place of innovation, of ambition, and, as Holmes had warned, of great danger. Weber gestured for us to sit, and I followed Holmes as he made his way to a chair at the centre of the room. Weber's demeanour had shifted subtly since our confrontation outside. The cool, detached scientist had become a man on edge, and I could sense the weight of his secrets pressing heavily upon him. "You've come at a most inopportune time, Mr. Holmes," Weber said, his voice now laced with a hint of frustration. "The hive protocol is more than just a theory. It's a reality, and it's not something you can simply dismiss." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied Weber intently. "And yet you've kept it hidden. Why?" Weber's gaze flickered for a moment, his fingers twitching as though he were battling with some internal conflict. "The world isn't ready for it," he muttered, almost to himself. "You don't understand the power it holds, the ability to control the collective mind, to unite humanity in a way that could end wars, end famine, end poverty. It's It's the next step in human evolution, Mr. Holmes. I could see Holmes's expression harden as Weber spoke, his skepticism growing with every word. You believe that by manipulating the human mind, you can create a utopia? Holmes asked sharply. That you can bend the will of every individual to your own design, without regard for their freedom, their autonomy. Weber's eyes gleamed with fervour, his voice rising with intensity. It's not about control, Mr. Holmes. It's about unity. Humanity has always been divided by geography, by culture, by ideology. The Hive Protocol will erase all of that. Everyone working together, sharing one consciousness, one goal. It's the future, the only future. I could sense that we were getting closer to the heart of Weber's obsession. His eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed almost fevered now, and I couldn't help but wonder just how far he was willing to go in pursuit of his vision. But, Doctor, I interjected, you're not speaking of unity in any true sense. You're talking about subjugation, about stripping away the very essence of what makes people individuals. You would turn them into puppets, controlled by a single mind. How can you not see that as a tyranny? Holmes gave me a quick glance, but it was clear he was allowing me to speak my piece. Weber, however, seemed unperturbed by my words. If anything, they only seemed to reinforce his belief in the necessity of his work. You don't understand, Weber repeated, this time, almost pleadingly. It's the only way forward. If we continue as we are, divided, fragmented, the world will fall apart. But if we can merge minds, unite them. And who, Holmes interrupted, his voice cold, decides who controls the hive? Who is the one who sits at the centre, pulling the strings? Weber's eyes flickered, his gaze shifting momentarily to a large tank at the far end of the room. It was filled with a murky liquid, and in the centre, suspended in the fluid, was what appeared to be a human figure, or at least the form of one. The figure was motionless, its features indistinguishable in the gloom. That, Weber said, his voice suddenly sombre, is the next step, the first successful test subject. It's taken months of refinement, but we're close now, close to perfecting the protocol. I felt my blood run cold as I followed his gaze to the tank. The figure inside appeared lifeless, and yet there was something disturbingly familiar about the form. The pale skin, the features that were almost human but not quite. It was as though the figure was a distorted reflection of a person who had once lived. Holmes stood up abruptly, his expression a mixture of disgust and disbelief. You've done this to someone. You've turned them into this? Weber's eyes darkened, but he stood his ground. I didn't do this, Mr. Holmes. The process isn't perfect. There have been complications along the way, but we are learning, evolving. The figure in the tank seemed to shift slightly, and I caught my breath. There was a faint, almost imperceptible twitch of movement. I felt my pulse quicken. Holmes's gaze remained fixed on the tank. And you expect us to believe that this is progress? That this is somehow the key to the future? What you're describing, Doctor, is nothing more than madness. Weber's face flushed with frustration. You're wrong. You'll see. Soon, you'll all see. It's the future, Mr. Holmes, the only future. The air in the laboratory seemed to grow colder, heavier. I could hear the faint hum of machinery in the background, but it was now accompanied by an eerie, almost otherworldly sound, a low, pulsating hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the room. Holmes turned sharply to face Webber. "You're deluded, Doctor, and you're not the only one. I suspect that Halpern has had a hand in this as well, hasn't he? You've been working together, trying to perfect the protocol." Webber's eyes narrowed. For a moment I thought he might deny it, but then his shoulders sagged, and he nodded reluctantly. "Yes, Halpern. He's been funding the research. He believes that if we perfect the hive protocol, we can control the masses, manipulate society, bring about a new world order. And you're both willing to sacrifice innocent lives to make that happen." Holmes shot back, his voice cold with contempt. "You've crossed a line, Doctor, and now you're both on the verge of unleashing something that could change the world forever. If you succeed, you'll be responsible for the deaths of millions. Maybe more." Webber's eyes flickered with something like doubt, but he quickly masked it, his gaze hardening once more. "You don't understand," he repeated, his voice low and strained. "You'll never understand." Holmes stepped forward, his voice firm and resolute. "We will stop you, Webber, and we will stop Halpern. Your vision of the future is not one we are willing to allow." Webber seemed to stiffen, as if bracing himself for some final confrontation. His hand hovered over a nearby switch, and I could see the hesitation in his eyes. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Webber said almost quietly, "but I will do whatever it takes to finish this, whatever it takes." I could see Holmes's eyes flicker with recognition. "Then we have no choice, Doctor. We must stop you." Before I could react, Holmes made a swift movement, knocking the switch from Weber's hand. The room seemed to shift, the tension between us palpable. And then, without warning, the figure in the tank stirred again. Chapter 18. The truth in the honeycomb. The laboratory was silent, the tension thick in the air as we all stood motionless, watching the figure inside the tank. For a moment it seemed as though time had paused. Everything hung in the balance. Holmes was poised and focused, his gaze fixed upon Weber, while I stood, trying to make sense of the chilling scene unfolding before us. The figure in the tank moved again, this time with more purpose. It wasn't just a twitch, but a deliberate shift, a slow, deliberate rising of its limbs as if it were preparing to awaken fully. My heart skipped a beat. I could see the pale, almost translucent skin of the figure, the jagged, unnatural contours of its face. A mask of humanity, but something far from it. It was a being trapped between two worlds, both human and something else entirely. "What have you done?" I whispered, horrified, to no one in particular. Weber was trembling now, his face contorted with a mix of fear and determination. He had lost control, and he knew it. "It's too late," he murmured, almost pleading. "You can't stop it now. Once the protocol is initiated, there's no turning back. It will be the dawn of a new era." Holmes stepped forward, unflinching. "No, Doctor, it will be the end of one. The end of any hope for freedom or autonomy. You've been playing God, and now you must face the consequences of your actions." The figure inside the tank seemed to twitch again, and suddenly the strange, humming sound that had been echoing through the room grew louder. The tanks on the walls began to pulse with light, as if responding to some hidden signal. A low, almost rhythmic buzz filled the space, and I realized with a shock that it was coming from the tanks themselves. They were alive with a purpose I could hardly comprehend. Holmes turned to Weber, his voice now edged with urgency. "What's happening, Doctor? What have you done to them? To the others?" Weber's eyes flickered toward the tanks. "They're awakening. The protocol is activating. The others are connected now, their minds linked. They'll be the first of many. Once the process is complete, there will be no more division, no more war. Only unity, only the hive." But even as he spoke, the room seemed to shift in the light of the growing pulse. The once serene atmosphere of the lab had become one of dread, as if the very air was thick with the weight of his words. "The hive," Holmes said slowly, his tone filled with disbelief, "was never about unity. It was about control. And now it will be your undoing." Before Weber could react, there was a sudden deafening sound, a sharp metallic clang that echoed throughout the room. I spun toward the noise, my eyes widening as I saw the tank nearest us begin to crack. The glass split with a horrifying screech, and the fluid inside began to bubble and froth as the figure inside it began to writhe. "Get back!" Holmes shouted, pulling me away just as the tank shattered, sending shards of glass and the strange fluid splashing across the floor. The figure within, now fully awake, staggered forward, its limbs jerking as though it had no control over its own body. It moved with a strange mechanical precision, as though it was both human and something otherworldly, a being born of science, of a mind twisted by its creator's ambitions. Holmes wasted no time. "Watson, the fire extinguisher!" he barked. I dashed to grab the large canister mounted by the door, but before I could make it back, Weber lunged towards the nearest switch. "No!" Holmes shouted, reaching out to stop him, but it was too late. The room seemed to tremble as a high-pitched sound, like the buzzing of thousands of angry bees, filled the air. The figure in the tank, now fully awake, turned its head to face us, its eyes gleaming with an unnatural intelligence. It was as though it had been birthed not from a human mind, but from something else entirely, something far darker. "Weber, stop this now!" Holmes commanded, but Weber was beyond reason. His obsession had taken hold of him completely. He was consumed with the vision of a perfect society, a perfect world where control was absolute. The figure moved forward, each step deliberate, its limbs stiff and unyielding, yet strangely coordinated. I realized then that it wasn't just one mind at play, but many, countless minds bound together in a single collective. The hive, as Weber had called it, was no longer just an experiment. It was a reality, and it was terrifying. Holmes's face hardened as he turned to face Weber, his voice calm but filled with authority. "You've made a grave mistake, Doctor. Your creation, your abomination, will not be allowed to spread. The lives of innocents are at stake, and you will be held accountable for every one of them." But Weber's eyes had glazed over, his thoughts consumed by his work. "You don't understand. This is the way forward. The world will be united, free from conflict. The hive will lead us to a new era." Holmes's voice cut through the air like a sharp blade. "A new era of tyranny, Doctor. A world where minds are enslaved, where there is no freedom, where the individual is lost forever." Weber's hand trembled as he reached for another control, but before he could activate it, the figure lunged at him, its limbs moving with a speed and ferocity that defied its mechanical appearance. Weber's scream echoed through the lab as the creature grabbed him by the shoulders, its grip unyielding. In that moment, I saw the truth of it, the truth of the hive. It was not a utopia, it was a prison. And the creature before us, a twisted reflection of human potential, was both a victim and a perpetrator of that very prison. Holmes moved swiftly, pulling me back as the figure continued its violent motion, shaking Weber as though he were nothing more than a doll. The room had descended into chaos, but even in the midst of it, Holmes's mind was working at a breakneck pace. He had to stop the process before it could spread any further. "Watson, we need to stop the power." "Source," Holmes commanded, his voice firm. "If we sever the connection, we can halt the hive before it grows any stronger." I nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. I rushed toward the main console, where a series of wires and cables were connected to the tanks and the various machines. A quick glance at the control panel confirmed what I had feared. The entire facility was designed to amplify the connection between the subjects. Amplify the hive. I grabbed the nearest wire and yanked it free from its socket. The effect was immediate. The buzzing sound intensified for a moment, before cutting off completely. The tanks, once filled with fluid, began to drain, and the lights flickered in response. The strange movement in the room slowed. Weber's body went limp in the creature's grip, and the figure seemed to pause, its head turning slowly toward us. "Holmes!" I gasped. "Is it over?" Holmes stepped forward cautiously, his eyes locked on the figure. "For now, Watson," he said, his voice hard, "but the true danger lies in the minds that have already been linked. The hive may have been stopped, but its influence remains." As the last of the tanks drained, the figure collapsed to the floor with a soft thud. It was still, lifeless. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker had been unleashed upon the world. Holmes turned, to me his expression sombre. "We must ensure that this research is destroyed, Watson. The consequences of its existence cannot be allowed to continue." With the last of the machines now powered down, the laboratory fell silent once more. But in the silence, I knew that the echoes of the hive would linger long after we left this place. The true danger, I realized, wasn't in the creation itself, but in the human desire to control, to manipulate the minds of others for a greater cause, no matter the cost. And as we stepped out into the cool evening air, I couldn't help but wonder how many more minds, like Weber's, would fall prey to such dangerous ambitions.